The morning sun always touched the eastern window of the library first, and I sat there in my high-backed leather wing chair, watching the dust motes dance in the shaft of light, while the steam from my cup of Earl Grey tea curled upward in lazy ribbons. I lifted the porcelain cup to my lips and inhaled the scent of bergamot and dried lavender, which was a small luxury I allowed myself every single morning before the world had a chance to demand anything from me. The warmth of the china seeped into my fingers, which were slightly stiff from the damp coastal air, but steady and capable as I took a slow sip and let the bitter and floral liquid wash over my tongue. I set the cup down on the mahogany side table with a soft clink and turned my gaze toward the large bay window that overlooked the sprawling cliffs of the Pacific coastline, where the waves crashed against the jagged gray rocks with a rhythmic thrumming that I could feel in the floorboards beneath my slippered feet. I had lived in this house for 40 years, and it was a fortress of solitude and memory that my late husband Richard and I had built with the proceeds of our life's work. Richard was gone now, having passed 5 years ago from a heart attack that took him quickly and mercifully, but left me alone in these 3,000 square feet of silence. Most people my age would have found the silence oppressive or frightening, but I found it to be a clean slate where I could think without interruption and organize my mind like the ledgers I used to balance back when I was the most feared forensic accountant in the state. I adjusted the silk shawl around my shoulders and reached for the iPad that sat on the table next to my tea, because even at 72 years old, I never started my day without reviewing the Asian markets and checking the performance of my diversified portfolio. My fingers tapped the glass screen with precision as I scrolled through the numbers and saw that the tech stocks I had purchased 6 months ago were up 12%, which brought a small and satisfied smile to my face. They thought I was just an old woman gardening and knitting, but inside my head, the gears were turning as sharply as a Swiss watch, and I knew exactly where every penny of my wealth was located down to the decimal point. I closed the iPad cover with a soft snap and stood up from the chair, feeling the satisfying pop in my knees as I walked toward the French doors that led to the back garden. I unlocked the latch and pushed the doors open to let the salty ocean breeze flood into the room and mix with the smell of old books and floor wax. I stepped out onto the stone patio and walked toward my prize roses, which were demanding my attention with their overgrown thorny branches that seemed to reach out for me like needy children. I picked up the heavy iron shears from the garden bench, and the cold metal felt grounding in my palm as I approached the bushes to begin the necessary work of pruning. I snipped away the dead brown heads and the weak stems, because a garden could only thrive if you were ruthless about cutting away what was no longer serving the whole. Snip and crunch and snap went the shears as I worked, and the sound was rhythmic and meditative until it was interrupted by a noise that did not belong in my sanctuary. I froze with the shears held in mid-air and tilted my head to listen as the low rumble of a car engine grew louder and the distinct popping sound of tires crushing gravel echoed up the long, winding driveway. I was not expecting visitors, and the gardener came on Tuesdays, and the housekeeper came on Fridays, and today was a Wednesday, so there was no logical reason for anyone to be approaching my home. I lowered the shears and wiped my hands on my apron as I walked around the side of the house toward the front driveway where a silver sedan was pulling up to the front steps with a speed that seemed aggressive and rude. The car engine cut off, and the driver's door opened, and my heart gave a strange stutter in my chest when I saw my son Julian step out onto the pavement. He looked thinner than the last time I had seen him at Christmas, and his suit looked expensive, but rumpled, as if he had slept in it, or driven for a very long time without stopping. I stood there by the corner of the house and watched as the passenger door opened and his wife Tara emerged, wearing oversized sunglasses and a pair of heels that were entirely impractical for the seaside terrain. She smoothed down her dress and looked up at the house with an expression that I could only describe as calculating while Julian walked around to the trunk of the car and popped it open. My stomach tightened when I saw him lift out 2 large suitcases and set them heavily on the ground, and then reach back in for 2 more. I took a deep breath and composed my face into a mask of pleasant maternal surprise before I stepped out from the shadow of the house and called out to them. Julian jumped slightly and turned to face me, and I saw a flash of guilt cross his eyes before he plastered on a wide and charming smile that did not quite reach the rest of his face. He walked toward me with his arms open and engulfed me in a hug that smelled of stale coffee and nervous sweat and too much cologne. He told me that it was so good to see me, and he squeezed me a little too hard, as if he were trying to reassure himself rather than me. I patted his back stiffly and pulled away to look at Tara, who was walking up the steps with her sunglasses now pushed up onto her head to reveal eyes that were scanning the facade of my home, looking for cracks in the masonry, or perhaps estimating its market value. She kissed the air next to my cheek and told me I looked wonderful, but her voice had that high and sickly sweet pitch that people use when talking to toddlers or the infirm. I asked them what they were doing here with all that luggage and why they hadn't called to let me know they were coming. Julian exchanged a quick glance with Tara that lasted only a fraction of a second, but in my profession, I had made a career out of noticing the things people tried to hide in fractions of seconds. He turned back to me and put his hand on my shoulder and dropped his voice to a tone of deep concern as he told me that they had been worried about me lately. I frowned and asked him why on earth he would be worried about me, since I was perfectly healthy, and my last physical exam had been excellent. Tara stepped forward and placed her hand on my other arm, so I was trapped between them, and she said that they knew it must be lonely for me out here, all by myself in this big, old house. She said they had been talking, and they decided that it wasn't right for me to be alone anymore, especially at my age, when things could happen so suddenly. I felt a cold prickle of irritation run down my spine because I hated being spoken to, as if I were a delicate antique that was about to shatter. But I kept my voice calm and told them I was perfectly fine and that I enjoyed my solitude. Julian shook his head and said that they wanted to be here for me and that they had decided to come and stay for a while to help me out around the house and make sure I was safe. He said it as if he were doing me a great favor, but I looked at the 4 large suitcases on the driveway, and I knew that people did not bring that much luggage for a weekend visit. I asked him how long a while was, and he avoided my eyes and looked past me at the front door as he said that they didn't have a specific timeline, and they just wanted to spend some quality time with family. He picked up 2 of the suitcases and started walking toward the front door without waiting for me to invite him in, and I watched his back and realized that this was not a request, but an invasion. Tara smiled at me again and picked up her tote bag and followed him, and I was left standing alone on the driveway with the wind whipping my hair across my face. I followed them inside, and the sound of the suitcase wheels rolling over my hardwood floors sounded like thunder in the quiet house. They dumped their bags in the middle of the grand foyer, and Julian stood with his hands on his hips, looking around the space as if he were measuring it for drapes. He told me that they would take the guest suite in the east wing because it had the best view, and he started hauling the bags up the stairs before I could even suggest that perhaps we should sit down and discuss this first. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and watched them ascend, and I felt a heavy weight settle in the pit of my stomach, because I knew my son, and I knew that he was selfish and lazy, and he had never done anything in his life solely for the benefit of another person. If Julian was here, it was because he wanted something, and if he brought Tara, it was because he needed help getting it. I walked into the kitchen and saw that Tara had already followed me in and was opening my refrigerator and moving things around. She took out a pitcher of iced tea and poured herself a glass without asking, and then leaned against the counter and told me that the house felt a little dusty and that she would help me get it organized properly. I looked at my spotless counters and the gleaming stainless steel appliances, And I knew she was lying, but I forced a smile and told her that was very kind of her. I watched her drink the tea and leave a wet ring on the granite countertop, and I had to fight the urge to reach for a cloth and wipe it up immediately. The rest of the afternoon was a blur of noise and disruption as they unpacked their things and took over the guest suite, which had been Richard's favorite room because of the morning light. I retreated to my library and sat in my chair, but the peace was gone because I could hear their footsteps thumping on the ceiling above me and the muffled sound of their voices arguing in hushed tones. I tried to read my book, but the words swam on the page, and my mind kept circling back to the look in Julian's eyes when he first arrived. It was evening when I finally emerged and found them sitting in the living room, watching the television at a volume that was far too loud. Julian had a glass of my best scotch in his hand, and his feet were propped up on the coffee table on top of a stack of art books. He grinned when saw me and told me to come and sit down and relax because Tara was going to order pizza for dinner. I told him I didn't eat pizza because of the sodium and the grease, but he just waved his hand and said I should live a little. I sat in the armchair opposite them and watched them as the blue light of the television flickered over their faces. They looked comfortable and settled as if they had lived here for years, and that terrified me more than anything else. Later that night, after I had retired to my own bedroom and locked the door, which was something I had never felt the need to do before I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. The house usually settled with familiar creaks and groans that sounded like a lullaby, but tonight every sound made me tense my muscles. I heard the floorboards creak in the hallway outside my door, and I held my breath as I watched the shadow of feet pause under the crack of light at the bottom of the door. Whoever it was stood there for a long time, just listening and waiting, and I lay perfectly still, with my hand clutching the sheet until the shadow finally moved away, and I heard the soft click of a door closing down the hall. I realized then that my golden cage had been breached and that the predators were not outside trying to get in, but were already inside sleeping down the hall. I closed my eyes and visualized the layout of my assets and the security codes to my accounts, and I made a silent vow to the ghost of my husband that I would not let them take what we had built. I drifted into a restless sleep, dreaming of shears cutting through stems. But in the dream, the stems were not roses, but fingers grasping at my wallet. The smell of burning bacon was the first thing to assault my senses the next morning, and it dragged me out of a deep and dreamless sleep with a jolt of alarm that made my heart hammer against my ribs. For 40 years, I had woken up to the smell of salt air and freshly ground coffee beans and silence. But today, the air was thick with the greasy scent of pork fat and the loud clattering of pans coming from the kitchen downstairs. I sat up and rubbed my face with hands that felt heavy and tired because I had spent half the night listening to the unfamiliar sounds of 2 other people breathing and moving in my house. I swung my legs out of bed and planted my feet on the cool hardwood floor, and I took a moment to center myself and count backward from 10, which was a trick I had learned during high-stress audits in my 30s to keep my blood pressure from spiking. I dressed slowly and deliberately, choosing a pair of tailored linen trousers and a soft cashmere sweater in a shade of pale blue that Richard used to say matched my eyes. I brushed my hair until it shone silver in the mirror and applied a touch of lipstick because I refused to let them see me looking disheveled or unprepared in my own home. When I walked down the staircase, I gripped the banister a little tighter than usual because the house felt different, as if the air pressure had changed overnight. I walked into the kitchen and stopped in the doorway to survey the chaos that Tara had unleashed upon my sanctuary. Every cabinet door seemed to be open, and a carton of eggs was sitting perilously close to the edge of the granite island while a frying pan smoked on the stove. Tara was standing there in a silk kimono that was far too short, and she was flipping bacon with a metal spatula that was scraping screechingly against my non-stick pan, which made my teeth ache. She turned and saw me and flashed a bright smile that showed too many teeth and told me to sit down because she was making a family breakfast. I looked at the mess and the grease splatters on the stovetop that had been pristine 12 hours ago, and I felt a tight knot of anger form in my stomach. But I forced it down and pulled out a stool at the island. Julian walked in from the patio holding a mug of coffee, and he kissed the top of my head and told me I looked rested, even though we both knew I had dark circles under my eyes. He sat down next to me and started talking about how great it was to wake up by the ocean and how the air was so much cleaner here than in the city. I nodded politely and reached for the coffee pot to pour myself a cup. But when I lifted it, the pot was impossibly light and empty. Tara laughed a tinkling little laugh that grated on my nerves and said she was sorry, but she and Julian had finished the pot, and she hadn't made a fresh one because she didn't know if I was supposed to have caffeine at my age. She said it with a tilt of her head and a look of faux concern, as if she were talking about a toddler who might get too hyper. I stared at her for a long moment and told her clearly that I had been drinking coffee since before she was born, and that my heart was perfectly capable of handling a cup of Arabica. She just shrugged and turned back to the bacon, saying she would make some herbal tea for me instead, because it was better for my nerves. I didn't want herbal tea. I wanted my morning ritual, but I realized in that moment that fighting over coffee would make me seem petty and irritable, so I stayed silent and watched her plate the burnt bacon. After breakfast, which was an ordeal of forced conversation and greasy food, I escaped to my study to check my emails and regain some sense of control. My study was the one room in the house that was strictly off-limits to everyone else, and it was where I kept all my files and my computer and my safe. I walked in and closed the heavy oak door behind me and let out a long breath as I leaned against the wood and closed my eyes for a second. I walked over to my large mahogany desk, which sat in the center of the room facing the window, and I sat down in my leather chair, ready to start my day. I reached out automatically to the right side of the desk, where I always kept my reading glasses sitting on top of a small stack of leather-bound journals. My hand grasped at empty air, and my fingers brushed the smooth leather of the journal cover, but the glasses were not there. I frowned and looked down, thinking perhaps they had slid off, but the surface of the desk was clear and uncluttered, just the way I always left it. I checked the drawers, opening them one by one, and scanning the contents, which were organized with military precision. Pens in one slot, paper clips in another, and stationery in the third. The glasses were nowhere to be found, and a small prickle of unease started to itch at the back of my neck because I was not a person who lost things. I stood up and checked the pockets of my sweater, and then I got down on my hands and knees to look under the desk, thinking maybe I had knocked them over yesterday without realizing it. The carpet was clean and empty, and I stood back up, feeling a flush of heat rise in my cheeks because I knew for a fact that I had placed them on the journals last night before I went to bed. I remembered the specific sound of the plastic frames clicking against the leather cover, and I remembered taking them off and rubbing the bridge of my nose right before I turned off the desk lamp. I opened the door and walked back out into the hallway, where I ran into Julian, who was coming out of the living room scrolling through something on his phone. I asked him if he had seen my reading glasses, and I tried to keep my voice casual as if it didn't matter. He looked up and frowned and asked me if I had checked my bedroom or the kitchen. I told him I hadn't been to the bedroom since I woke up, and I hadn't taken them to the kitchen, so they had to be in the study. He slipped his phone into his pocket and gave me a sympathetic smile and said he would help me look because things have a way of walking off sometimes. We went back into the study, and he started looking around the room, lifting up books and looking behind the curtains while I stood by the desk, feeling foolish and frustrated. "Here they are, Mom," Julian said, after only 30 seconds, and his voice was light and breezy. I turned around and saw him standing by the bookshelf on the far side of the room, holding my glasses up by the earpiece. He said they were sitting right there on the shelf next to the encyclopedias, and asked me if I had been reading over there last night. I stared at the glasses and then at the shelf, and I felt a cold sensation wash over me, because I hadn't touched those encyclopedias in 5 years. I shook my head and told him that was impossible because I hadn't been near that shelf, and I distinctly remembered putting them on the desk. Julian walked over and handed them to me, and he put a hand on my shoulder and squeezed it gently. "It's okay, Mom," he said softly. "You probably just walked over there absent-mindedly and set them down and forgot about it. It happens to everyone." He smiled and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there holding the glasses, which felt cold and alien in my hand. I looked at the desk and then at the bookshelf and back to the desk, and my mind replayed the memory of the night before like a videotape. I saw myself sitting at the desk, and I saw myself taking off the glasses, and I saw myself placing them on the journals. I knew I was right, but the physical evidence was staring me in the face, and for the first time in my life, I felt a tiny hairline fracture in my confidence. Had I walked over to the shelf? Was it possible that I had done something without registering it? I put the glasses on, and the world snapped back into focus, but the unease remained like a stone in my shoe. I spent the next hour reviewing my emails, but my concentration was shot, and I kept looking over at the bookshelf as if it were mocking me. I decided to take a break and go for a walk in the garden to clear my head, so I grabbed my sun hat from the hook on the door and went to the front hall table where I kept my house keys in a small ceramic bowl. The bowl was empty. I stared at the painted blue patterns on the bottom of the bowl and blinked rapidly, thinking that my eyes were playing tricks on me again. I patted my pockets and checked the floor around the table, but the keys were gone. I felt a surge of panic rising in my chest now, not because the keys were missing, but because this was happening twice in one morning. "Tara!" I called out, and my voice sounded sharper than I intended. Tara appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and asked me what was wrong. I asked her if she had seen my keys, and I pointed to the empty bowl. She looked at the bowl and then looked at me with a confused expression and said she hadn't touched them. "Are you sure you didn't leave them in the door?" she asked innocently. "I never leave them in the door," I snapped. "I always put them in the bowl." She walked over to the front door and opened it, and there, dangling from the lock on the outside of the door, was my keychain with the silver fox charm that Richard had given me. "Oh, Eleanor," she said with a sigh that sounded like she was disappointed in me. "You left them right in the lock on the outside. Anyone could have just walked in last night. That's really dangerous." She pulled the keys out and handed them to me, and her fingers brushed mine, and her skin felt dry and cool. I took the keys, and my hand was trembling slightly, not from age, but from a mixture of rage and confusion. I knew I had locked the door last night because I had checked it 3 times after I heard them moving around. I remembered the distinct click of the deadbolt, and I remembered pulling the keys out and walking to the table and dropping them in the bowl with a clatter. "I locked the door," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I remember locking it." Tara patted my arm and gave me a look that was dripping with pity. "I'm sure you thought you did," she said soothingly, "but obviously you forgot to take them out. It's okay. We're here now, so we can help you keep track of these things." She turned and walked back to the kitchen, humming a little tune, and I stood there in the hallway, clutching the cold metal keys so hard that the edges bit into my palm. I looked at the heavy wooden door, and then at the bowl, and I realized that something very specific and very malicious was happening. They were moving my things. It was such a petty and childish thing to do that it almost seemed laughable, but the intent behind it was deadly serious. They were trying to make me doubt my own memory. They wanted me to believe that I was slipping and that I was becoming the forgetful old woman they needed me to be, so they could justify taking control. I walked out onto the porch and sat down on the rocking chair, and I forced myself to breathe deep, rhythmic breaths of the salty air. I looked out at the ocean and watched the waves crash against the rocks, and I let the anger burn hot and bright inside me because anger was useful. Anger was fuel. If they wanted to play games, I would play games, but they had made a critical error in their strategy. They assumed that because I was old, I was feeble, and they assumed that because I was quiet, I was confused. They didn't know that for 30 years, I had tracked embezzlers who were far smarter and far more subtle than they were. I closed my eyes and replayed the morning in my head, analyzing the timeline and the opportunities. Julian had been alone in the hallway while I was in the bathroom. Tara had been downstairs before I woke up. It would have been the work of seconds to move the glasses or the keys. I opened my eyes and looked back at the house which loomed over me like a brooding, silent witness. I would not say anything else about the missing items. I would not argue with them when they found things in the wrong places. I would let them think their plan was working. But from this moment on, I would document everything. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone and opened the voice memo app. I looked around to make sure no one was watching, and then I hit the red record button and held the phone up to my ear, as if I were making a call. September 14th. I whispered into the phone, my voice steady and cold. Incident 1. Reading glasses moved from desk to bookshelf. Incident 2. House keys moved from bowl to exterior lock. Subjects: Julian and Tara. Objective: induce doubt in my cognitive abilities. Counter strategy: observation and evidence gathering. Let the record show that I am of sound mind and I am on to them. I stopped the recording and slipped the phone back into my pocket. I stood up and smoothed down my trousers and walked back into the house with my head held high. If they wanted a senile old woman, I would give them a performance worthy of an Academy Award. But while they were watching the show, I would be watching them. 3 days had passed since the incident with the keys, and the house had transformed from a sanctuary into a minefield where every step I took felt like a calculated risk. I found myself moving through the rooms with a hesitation that was entirely foreign to me, constantly checking behind me and double-checking the placement of every object I touched. The air in the house felt heavier and thicker, as if the tension between us had physical mass, displacing the oxygen and making it harder for me to draw a full breath. It was a Tuesday afternoon and the coastal fog had rolled in early, pressing against the windows like a wall of wet gray cotton that obscured the ocean and turned the world outside into a featureless void. The dampness seeped through the glass and settled into my bones, making my joints ache with a dull and throbbing pain that I usually ignored. But today, it felt amplified by the stress knotting my shoulders. I decided that a pot of strong ginger tea was the only remedy for the chill. So I made my way to the kitchen, where the silence was only broken by the hum of the refrigerator. I filled the copper kettle with filtered water, and the sound of the water rushing from the tap was loud and clear in the quiet room. I placed the kettle on the front burner of the gas stove and turned the dial, hearing the familiar tick-tick whoosh as the blue ring of flame ignited with a soft pop. I stood there and watched the water boil, refusing to leave the room because I had developed a new paranoia about leaving anything unattended even for a moment. When the whistle blew, a shrill and piercing shriek that always made me jump slightly, I poured the water into my ceramic teapot and then I performed the ritual that I had started doing ever since the key incident. I turned the dial to the off position and watched the blue flame die out instantly. Then, I placed my hand on the dial and said out loud to the empty room, "The stove is off, the dial is vertical, the flame is gone." I touched the black metal grate to ensure it was cooling down, and I physically traced the line of the counter with my finger to imprint the memory into my brain. I was not leaving anything to chance. I picked up my tray with the teapot and a single cup and walked out of the kitchen, feeling a grim sense of satisfaction that I had secured the perimeter. I took the tea into the sunroom, which was currently devoid of sun, but still offered the best light for reading, and I settled into the wicker armchair with a book on forensic accounting history that I had read a dozen times before. I poured the tea, and the spicy scent of ginger rose up in the steam, clearing my sinuses and grounding me in the present moment. I read for perhaps an hour, losing myself in the comfort of numbers and logic, where X always equaled X, and there was no room for interpretation or deceit. The smell hit me before the sound did. It started as a faint underlying odor, something acrid and chemical that didn't belong in a house filled with lavender and old paper. I sniffed the air, frowning, and lowered my book. It smelled like rotten eggs and sulfur, a smell that triggered a primal alarm in the reptilian part of my brain. "Gas," I whispered, and the word hung in the air like a curse. I stood up so quickly that my book slid off my lap and hit the floor with a thud, but I didn't stop to pick it up. I walked briskly toward the hallway, and as I got closer to the kitchen, the smell became overpowering, making my eyes water and my throat constrict. "Mother?" Tara's voice floated down from the top of the stairs, sounding casual and unconcerned. "Do you smell that?" I called out, my voice tight with panic. I rushed into the kitchen and froze in the doorway. The front burner, the exact one I had used, was hissing loudly. The flame was out, but the dial was turned all the way to the high position, pumping raw gas into the room. I ran forward, holding my breath, and twisted the dial back to off with a snap. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I reached up and threw open the window above the sink, gasping as the cold, foggy air rushed in to mix with the toxic fumes. "Oh my God, Eleanor!" Tara appeared in the doorway, her hands flying to her mouth in a gesture of shock that looked just a little too practiced. She was wearing a plush white robe and her hair was wrapped in a towel. Julian appeared behind her a second later, sniffing the air theatrically. "Mom!" Julian shouted, rushing over to me and grabbing my shoulders. "What did you do? The whole house smells like gas. You could have blown us all up." I pulled away from him, my back pressed against the cold granite of the counter. "I didn't do this," I said, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "I turned it off. I checked it." I said it out loud. Tara walked into the room, waving her hand in front of her nose and making a face of disgust. She walked over to the stove and looked at the dial, which was now off, then looked at me with wide, pitying eyes. "Eleanor, honey," she said, her voice dropping to that slow, exaggerated cadence she used now. "We were upstairs. No one else has been down here. You made tea, right? I saw you walk past with the tray." "I made tea," I admitted, "but I turned the stove off. I know I did." "Did you?" Julian asked, crossing his arms and leaning against the island. He looked at me not with anger, but with a profound sadness that was infinitely worse. "Mom, look at me. You left the gas running. If Tara hadn't come down—" "I didn't come down," Tara corrected him gently. "I smelled it from the hallway. Eleanor, this is dangerous, really dangerous." "I did not leave it on," I snapped, the anger finally breaking through the shock. "I turned it off. I touched the dial. I said the words." Tara exchanged a look with Julian. That same quick, meaningful glance I had seen on the driveway. She walked over to me and reached out to smooth a stray lock of hair from my forehead. I flinched away from her touch, which felt like the cold kiss of a snake. "It's okay to forget, sweetie," she cooed. "It happens, but we have to be realistic about what this means. You can't be using the stove anymore if you're going to get confused like this." "I am not confused!" I shouted, and the sound of my own voice startled me. It sounded shrill and desperate, exactly the way a crazy old woman would sound. Okay, Julian said, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "Let's not get upset. We'll handle the cooking from now on, okay? Just to be safe. We don't want you getting hurt." They stood there, united in their concern, a solid wall of youth and competence against my frailty. I looked at the stove, then at the window, and then at them. I knew, with the certainty of a mathematical proof, that I had turned that dial off, which meant that one of them had come downstairs, quietly entered the kitchen while I was reading, and turned the gas on. They had risked an explosion. They had risked our lives just to stage this scene. The realization washed over me like ice water. This wasn't just about money anymore. This wasn't just greed. This was sociopathic. They were willing to endanger the physical structure of the house and the lives within it to accelerate their timeline. "I'm going to my room," I said quietly, stepping around Tara. "Do you want me to help you up the stairs?" Tara asked, reaching for my elbow. "Don't touch me," I hissed, pulling my arm back. She recoiled as if I had slapped her and looked at Julian with tears welling up in her eyes. "I was just trying to help," she whimpered. "Let her go, Tara," Julian sighed. "She's just upset. She's embarrassed." I walked out of the kitchen, my spine stiff, refusing to look back. I climbed the stairs with steady, deliberate steps, even though my knees felt like water. I didn't go to my bedroom. I went to my study and locked the door with a loud click. I moved to the desk and sat down, my hands trembling as I reached for my journal. I needed to document this immediately. I needed to write down the sensory details while they were fresh. The smell, the sound of the hiss, the exact position of the dial. But as I reached for my favorite fountain pen, the one I kept in the marble holder, my hand grasped air. I looked down. The pen holder was empty. I opened the top drawer. No pen. I checked the floor. Nothing. Then I saw it. My expensive Mont Blanc pen, the one Richard had given me for our 30th anniversary, was stabbed point down into the potting soil of the ficus tree in the corner of the room. It looked violent, absurd, and undeniably deliberate. I walked over and pulled it out. The nib was clogged with dirt, ruined. I stared at the ruined pen and felt a tear, hot and angry, slide down my cheek. They were dismantling my world, piece by piece. They were taking my dignity, my confidence, and my tools. I sat back down at the desk and cleaned the pen as best I could with a tissue, my movements jerky and furious. I grabbed a cheap ballpoint from the back of the drawer and opened my journal. September 17th, I wrote, pressing so hard the paper nearly tore. The gas incident. They are escalating. They are trying to kill me or make me wish I was dead. Strategy shift required. I must stop defending and start attacking. I looked up at the window where the fog was pressing against the glass. I was trapped in this house with two monsters, but they had made a fatal mistake. They thought they were trapping a confused old lady. They didn't realize they had just locked themselves in a cage with a silver fox who had nothing left to lose. I took a deep breath, smelling the lingering faint trace of sulfur on my clothes. I would not cook again. I would not give them the opportunity. I would eat cold food. I would drink tap water. I would survive. And I would make them pay for the pen. The grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway chimed 2 times, and the deep resonant notes vibrated through the floorboards and traveled up the walls of the silent house until they reached me where I lay wide awake in my bed, staring at the shifting shadows on the plaster ceiling. Sleep had become a stranger to me in the last 3 days, because every time I closed my eyes, I smelled gas or felt the phantom weight of keys that weren't there, or heard the whisper of footsteps stopping just outside my bedroom door. I had taken to propping a heavy wooden chair under the doorknob before I got into bed, which was a humiliating precaution for a woman in her own home, but the solid resistance of the chair leg against the floor gave me the only peace of mind I could find. The house felt different at night. Now that they were here, because the silence wasn't empty anymore, but rather it felt pregnant with intent, and I lay there with my hands folded over my chest like a marble effigy on a tomb waiting for the next strike. The fog outside had thickened, and it pressed against the window panes like a physical weight, muffling the sound of the ocean until the crashing waves were nothing more than a distant rhythmic pulse that sounded like a failing heartbeat. I shifted my legs under the heavy down comforter and winced as my left hip gave a sharp twinge of protest, which was a reminder that while my mind was sharp, my body was still 72 years old and susceptible to the damp cold of the coastal night. I was just about to reach for the glass of water on my nightstand to soothe my dry throat when a sound stopped my hand in midair and froze the breath in my lungs. It was not the wind, and it was not the house settling, and it was not the scurrying of a mouse in the walls, but rather it was the low and urgent murmur of a human voice drifting up through the heating vents from the floor below. I held perfectly still and strained my ears against the silence, trying to isolate the sound and identify the speaker. And after a moment, I recognized the pitch and timbre of my son's voice. He sounded agitated, and the rhythm of his speech was fast and clipped, with short bursts of words, followed by tense silences, where he was obviously listening to someone on the other end of a line. I looked at the digital clock on my bedside table, which glowed with a harsh red light in the darkness, and confirmed that it was indeed 2:15 in the morning, which was not a time for casual conversation. A mother's instinct is a powerful and terrible thing, and mine was screaming at me that whatever was happening downstairs was the key to the nightmare I had been living for the past week. I pushed the covers back slowly and carefully, inching the fabric down so it wouldn't rustle, and I swung my legs over the edge of the high mattress until my bare feet touched the cold hardwood floor. The chill shot up my legs and made me shiver, but I welcomed the sensation because it sharpened my senses and woke me up fully. I reached for my robe, but decided against it because the silk would swish when I walked, and I needed to be as silent as a ghost if I wanted to catch a predator in the act. I stood up and waited for my equilibrium to settle, and then I moved toward the door and carefully removed the heavy chair I had wedged under the handle, lifting it inches off the floor so it wouldn't scrape. I turned the brass knob with agonizing slowness, twisting it millimeter by millimeter until the latch disengaged with a barely audible click, and I pulled the door open just enough to slip through into the hallway. The corridor was a tunnel of darkness, but I knew every inch of this house, and I navigated by memory and touch, keeping my hand on the wall as I moved toward the landing of the grand staircase. The voice got louder as I approached the stairs, and I realized he wasn't in the living room, but in the library. My library, which was directly below the landing where I now stood. I crouched down near the banister and peered through the wooden slats of the railing, looking down into the foyer, where a sliver of yellow light was spilling out from the partially open library door and cutting across the Persian rug like a jagged scar. I could hear him clearly now, and the desperation in his voice was so thick it was almost palpable, choking the air like the smoke from a dying fire. "I told you I need more time," Julian said, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. "You can't just change the terms like that. We had a deal." There was a silence while the person on the other end spoke, and I imagined a faceless voice, cold and indifferent, delivering bad news. "No, listen to me," Julian hissed, and I heard the sound of a hand slamming against a desk. My desk. "She's 72 years old. She's losing it. I told you the plan is working, but these things take time. I can't just force her to sign it over quietly, or the lawyers will contest it. It has to look like her idea." My blood ran cold, and my heart seemed to stop beating for a full second before starting again with a painful thud against my ribs. Hearing it out loud was different than suspecting it, because suspicion was a vapor. But these words were stones that bruised and broke. He was discussing my mental deterioration as a strategy, and he was using my age as a weapon against me to secure a timeline for his creditors. "I know the deadline," Julian said, and his voice dropped to a whimper that made me sick to my stomach. "Please, I'm begging you. Just give me 2 more weeks. I have the medical thing set up. Tara is working on the doctor. We're going to get the diagnosis, and then I get the power of attorney, and then I can liquidate the assets. The house alone is worth $4 million. You'll get your money plus the vig." I pressed my forehead against the cold wood of the banister and closed my eyes as a wave of nausea washed over me. $4 million. He had already appraised my home. He had already spent the money in his head. He wasn't here to care for me, and he wasn't here to be a family. He was here to harvest me. "Don't come here," Julian whispered urgently, and the fear in his voice was real and terrified. "If you show up here, it ruins everything. She's sharp, okay? She's still sharp in bursts. If she sees you, or if she gets suspicious, it's over. Just stay away. I'll get the signature. I promise." I heard the sound of the call ending, and then a loud clatter as he threw the phone onto the desk. I heard the creak of my leather chair as he collapsed into it, and then the sound of weeping. Ugly, jagged sobs of a man who has dug a grave so deep he can no longer see the sky. I stayed there, in the darkness, listening to my son cry, and I waited for the maternal instinct to kick in and make me want to go down there and comfort him. But it didn't come. Instead of pity, I felt a cold and crystalline clarity crystallize in my mind, like frost on a window pane. I was a forensic accountant, and I had spent 30 years looking at the wreckage of lives destroyed by greed and stupidity. I knew what kind of debt made a grown man cry in the middle of the night, and I knew what kind of people he was dealing with if he was begging them not to come to the house. These were not banks, and they were not credit card companies. These were sharks. Julian was drowning, and in his panic he had decided that the only way to save himself was to stand on my head and push me under. I pulled back from the railing, slowly moving with the stealth of the silver fox that Richard used to call me. I backed away down the hallway, placing my feet on the edges of the floorboards where the wood was supported by the joists so they wouldn't creak. I slipped back into my room and closed the door silently and replaced the chair under the knob. I climbed back into bed and pulled the covers up to my chin, but I knew I would not sleep again that night. I lay there and stared into the darkness, and I began to formulate a plan, because I now had the most dangerous weapon of all, which was information. I knew his timeline, and I knew his motivation, and I knew that he was operating under extreme pressure, which meant he was prone to making mistakes. He needed a diagnosis to get the power of attorney. He needed me to be incompetent. He needed the world to believe I was a senile old woman who couldn't be trusted with her own checkbook. "Very well, Julian," I whispered to the empty room, my voice steady and hard. "If you want a senile old woman, I will give you the performance of a lifetime." I would not confront him about the phone call because that would reveal that I was alert and mobile. I needed him to think I was exactly what he described, confused and deteriorating. But I needed to test the waters first. I needed to see just how desperate they were, and I needed concrete proof of their theft before I sprang the trap. I remembered the emergency cash stash I kept in the hollowed-out book in the library, a copy of War and Peace that sat on the bottom shelf. There was $500 in hundreds tucked inside, meant for emergencies when the power went out or the credit card systems failed. It was the perfect bait. I watched the red numbers on the clock change from 2:30 to 300 to 400, and I used the time to construct the next day in my head like a chess match. I would be groggy in the morning. I would be forgetful. I would leave the bait out, and then I would watch them take it. When the sun finally began to bleed gray light through the fog and into my room, I felt tired in my body, but my mind was electric with adrenaline. I got up and went to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, looking at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me had lines around her eyes and silver hair and pale skin. But her eyes were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a prosecutor. I went downstairs at 7 o'clock sharp, just as I always did. But I made sure to miss a button on my cardigan, and I left my hair slightly unkempt. I walked into the kitchen where Julian was sitting at the island drinking coffee and looking like death warmed over with dark circles under his eyes and a pallor that matched the gray morning. "Good morning, Mother," he said, and his voice was raspy. "Sleep well?" "I think so," I said vaguely, looking around the kitchen as if I wasn't sure where I was. I had the strangest dreams. I dreamt I heard voices. "Are there people in the house, Julian?" He froze with the mug halfway to his mouth and stared at me over the rim. "No, Mom," he said slowly. "Just us. You were dreaming." "Oh," I said, drifting over to the kettle. "I suppose I was. I feel so fuzzy today. I think I need to check my emergency fund." I woke up worried about the cash in the library. Julian set his mug down with a clatter. "What cash?" he asked, and the hunger in his voice was instantaneous and terrifying. "In the book," I mumbled, turning my back to him to hide the small smile that tugged at the corner of my mouth. "In War and Peace. I should count it. I feel like I might have spent it and forgotten." I could feel his eyes boring into my back, and I knew that the hook was set. I poured my tea and shuffled out of the room, leaving him alone with the information and the desperation and the opportunity. The game had officially begun. The library was bathed in a dull and diffused light that filtered through the fog outside and cast long shadows across the rows of leather-bound spines that lined the walls from floor to ceiling. I walked over to the bottom shelf near the fireplace, where the complete works of Tolstoy sat in heavy and imposing silence, and I knelt down on the Persian rug, feeling the stiffness in my knees as a sharp reminder of my mortality. I pulled out the thick volume of War and Peace, which was a hollowed-out prop I had bought at an antique fair years ago, and popped open the magnetic cover to reveal the small stack of currency resting in the velvet-lined cavity. 5 crisp $100 bills sat there, looking green and inviting against the red velvet, and I picked them up and ran my thumb over the textured paper, feeling the raised ink and the familiar linen quality of the cash. I stood up and walked over to the small round table by the reading chair, where I often sat in the afternoons, and I placed the bills in a neat stack right in the center of the polished wood surface. I fanned them out slightly, just like a dealer at a blackjack table, so that the denomination was clearly visible to anyone who might happen to walk past the open door. I knew Julian was hovering nearby because I could hear the faint squeak of his loafers on the hallway floorboards, and I could smell the acrid scent of his cigarette smoke clinging to his clothes, even though he swore he had quit years ago. I cleared my throat loudly and began to count the money in a voice that was just loud enough to carry into the corridor, but soft enough to sound like an old woman muttering to herself. 100, I said, placing a finger on the first bill. 200, 3, 4, 5. Yes, that's right. $500 for the gardener. I stood there for a moment, staring at the money, and willing my heart to slow down, because what I was about to do required a level of vulnerability that terrified me. I turned away from the table and walked toward the door, but stopped halfway and patted my pockets as if I had forgotten something. My tea, I murmured, making sure to project my voice toward the hallway. I left the kettle on. I shuffled out of the library and walked past the open doorway where Julian was leaning against the wall, pretending to look at a painting of a seascape that had hung there for 20 years. He didn't look at me as I passed, but I saw his eyes dart toward the library door the moment he thought I wasn't looking. I continued down the hall to the kitchen and made a great show of rattling the kettle and opening the pantry door to look for biscuits. I waited exactly 3 minutes, which was enough time for a crime of opportunity, but not enough time for second thoughts. I walked back toward the library with a slow and deliberate pace, and as I approached the door, I saw Tara coming out of the room with a quick and jerky step that screamed of guilt. She saw me and froze for a fraction of a second before smoothing down her blouse and flashing me a bright and artificial smile. "Just tidying up in here, Eleanor," she said, her voice a little too high and a little too breathless. "It was getting a bit dusty." I nodded vaguely and walked past her into the room, and my eyes went immediately to the small round table by the chair. The table was empty. The wood gleamed in the gray light, but the $500 was gone as if it had never existed. I felt a cold knot of fury tighten in my stomach, but I forced my face to crumble into a mask of confusion and distress. I walked over to the table and touched the surface with my hand, as if I could feel the ghost of the money that had been there just moments ago. "My money," I said, my voice trembling. I just put it here. $500. I counted it." Tara walked back into the room and stood behind me, and I could feel her presence like a looming shadow. "What money, Eleanor?" she asked softly. "The money for the gardener," I said, turning to face her and letting my hand shake visibly. "I took it out of the book. I put it right here on the table. 5 bills. I went to the kitchen for tea, and now it's gone." Julian appeared in the doorway then, and his face was a study in feigned innocence as he looked from me to the empty table and then to Tara. "What's going on?" he asked. "What's wrong with Mom?" "She says she left money on the table," Tara said, giving him a significant look. But I was just in here dusting, and there was nothing on the table, Julian. It was completely empty. I looked at Julian and I saw the bulge in his front trouser pocket, a rectangular shape that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. He saw me looking and casually put his hand in his pocket to mask the outline, but the gesture only confirmed what I already knew. It was here, I insisted, but I let my voice waver. I know it was here. I counted it. 1, 2, 3. Mom, Julian said, walking over and placing his hands on my shoulders. Listen to me. You probably just thought you put it there. Maybe you put it in your pocket. Or maybe you spent it yesterday and forgot. I didn't spend it, I whispered, looking down at the floor. I wouldn't forget $500. You forgot your glasses yesterday, Tara pointed out gently, moving closer to join the circle of gaslighting. And you forgot your keys in the door, and you forgot to turn off the stove. She listed my failures like a prosecutor reading charges, and I felt the weight of their narrative pressing down on me. They were building a reality where I was incompetent, and they were the caretakers, and every missing item was just another brick in that wall. I looked up at them, and I saw the gleam of victory in their eyes. They had the money, and they had the moral high ground, and they thought they had broken me. This was the moment. This was the turn. I let my shoulders slump, and I let the light go out of my eyes. I looked from the empty table to their faces, and I allowed a tear to spill over my eyelid and track down my cheek. I suppose you're right, I stammered, my voice cracking. I must be getting worse. I could have sworn I put it there, but if you didn't see it, then I must be imagining things. I saw the tension leave Julian's shoulders, and I saw Tara's smile widen just a fraction. They had won. I had accepted their version of reality. It's okay, Mom, Julian said, pulling me into a hug that felt like a betrayal. We're here. We'll help you keep track of things. You don't have to worry about money anymore. I'll handle the gardener. Thank you, I whispered into his chest, while my mind screamed in protest. I'm so sorry. I feel so foolish. Don't be sorry, Tara said, reaching out to stroke my arm. It's just part of getting older. Why don't you go upstairs and rest for a bit? We'll make lunch. I pulled away from Julian and nodded slowly, looking like a beaten woman. Yes, I said. I think I will lie down. I have a headache. I walked out of the library and climbed the stairs with heavy and plodding steps, holding onto the banister as if I couldn't support my own weight. I could feel their eyes on my back, and I could practically hear their silent celebration. They thought the $500 was a windfall. They thought they had just scored easy cash to pay off a debt or buy a reprieve. But as I reached the landing and turned the corner out of their sight, my posture straightened, and I wiped the tear from my cheek with a furious swipe of my hand. I walked into my bedroom and closed the door. But this time, I didn't lock it because a senile woman wouldn't remember to lock her door. I went to my desk and pulled out my journal and the cheap ballpoint pen. I opened it to the page dated today, and I wrote with a steady and firm hand. September 18th. The bait. Item: 500 cash. Location: library table. Time: 10:15 a.m. Outcome: stolen by Julian to Tara. Denied by both. Observation: Julian had the money in his right trouser pocket. Tara provided the cover story. Status: they have taken the bait. They believe I am confused and compliant. They will now get careless. I closed the journal and hid it under the loose floorboard beneath the rug in the corner of the room. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at the gray ocean outside. I had just paid $500 to confirm that my son was a thief and a liar. It was a high price to pay, but it was a necessary expense. Now I knew that there was no line they wouldn't cross. I lay back on the pillows and closed my eyes, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of calm. The uncertainty was gone. The war was declared, and while they were downstairs celebrating their small victory and spending my money, I was upstairs plotting the end game. They wanted control of my accounts? Fine. I would give them access. I would open the gates wide and let them rush in thinking they had found the kingdom. But they didn't know that the kingdom was mine. The morning light filtered through the sheer curtains of the dining room and illuminated the chaos of paper that I had deliberately spread across the mahogany table, like a sea of whitecaps on a dark ocean. I sat at the head of the table wearing my oldest cardigan and a pair of reading glasses that were slightly crooked on my nose, and I pressed my hands against my temples as if I were trying to hold my shattering mind together. In front of me lay a scattered pile of utility bills, property tax statements, and insurance premiums, all of which I had managed with my eyes closed for 40 years. But today, they were the props in my theater of decline. I heard the heavy thud of footsteps coming down the stairs, and I let out a long and shaky sigh that was loud enough to be heard in the hallway. Julian walked in first, wearing a crisp polo shirt and khakis that looked ready for a day of leisure, followed closely by Tara, who was scrolling on her phone with a bored expression that vanished the moment she saw the distress on my face. They stopped in the doorway and exchanged a look, that same predator's glance I had come to recognize, before Julian stepped forward with his concerned son mask firmly in place. "Mom?" he asked, walking over to the table and looking down at the mess of papers. "What's all this? You look like you're drowning in paperwork." "I am," I whispered, looking up at him with watery eyes. "I tried to pay the electric bill, but I can't find the checkbook." "Or maybe I already paid it? And the numbers on this tax form, they keep swimming around. I don't remember if I transferred the funds from the savings account." I pushed a stack of papers away from me with a frustrated sweep of my hand and let my head drop into my palms. "I used to be so good at this," I murmured into my hands. "I don't know what's happening to me, Julian. It's all just noise." I felt his hand on my shoulder, warm and heavy, and it took every ounce of my willpower not to shrug it off. "It's okay, Mom," he said soothingly. "You're just stressed. You've been through a lot lately with everything forgetting things. It's normal to get overwhelmed." "It's not normal for me," I said, lifting my head and looking at him with pleading eyes. "I'm afraid I'm going to make a mistake. I'm afraid I'm going to lose the house because I forgot to sign a piece of paper." Tara pulled out a chair and sat next to me, her perfume, a cloying scent of vanilla and musk, wafting over me. "Eleanor, why don't you let Julian help?" she suggested softly. "He has a business degree, remember? He handles all our finances. He could take this burden off your shoulders." I hesitated, biting my lip and looking at the checkbook that sat in the center of the table. It was a blue vinyl folder that held the checks and the debit card for my household account. This was not my main trust, nor was it my investment portfolio. It was a specific account I used for groceries, repairs, and utilities, which I kept funded with about $15,000. A significant sum to most, but a drop in the bucket compared to the rest of the estate. I don't know, I said weakly. I've always done it myself. Richard always said. Dad would want you to relax, Julian interrupted, his voice firm but gentle. He wouldn't want you crying over an electric bill. Let me handle the household expenses for a while, just until you feel better. I looked at the checkbook, then at Julian, and I let my shoulders sag in defeat. I reached out with a trembling hand and pushed the blue folder across the polished wood until it sat in front of him. Maybe you're right, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Just for a while. The pin for the card is... Oh dear. What is it? It was Richard's birthday. 412. Julian picked up the folder, and I saw his fingers tighten around it, the knuckles turning white with the force of his grip. He had it. He finally had a key to the kingdom, or so he thought. I'll take care of everything today, he said, tucking the folder under his arm and standing up with a newfound energy. Tara and I need to go into town anyway to get some groceries. The fridge is looking a little bare. We'll handle the bills and do a big shop for the house. You just rest. Thank you, Julian, I said, closing my eyes. That would be a relief. Get whatever we need. I trust you. The words tasted like ash in my mouth, but they were the magic spell that unlocked the cage. They hustled out of the room with a speed that was almost comical, talking in hushed, excited whispers as they headed for the front door. I heard the car start, the engine revving louder than necessary, and the crunch of gravel as they sped away toward the town and the freedom of my money. I waited until the sound of the car had faded completely into the distance before I dropped the act. I sat up straight in the chair and adjusted my glasses. The confusion vanished from my face, replaced by the cold, hard stare of the auditor I had been for 30 years. I stood up and walked calmly to my study, locking the door behind me. I sat at my desk and opened my laptop, the screen glowing blue in the dim room. I navigated to the bank's website and logged into my secure portal, bypassing the household view and going straight to the administrator dashboard that allowed me to monitor all sub-accounts in real time. I pulled up the household checking account and expanded the window so it filled the screen. The balance sat at $15,432.18. Go ahead, Julian, I whispered to the screen. Show me who you are. I poured myself a fresh cup of tea and waited. It didn't take long. The first transaction hit at 10:42 a.m. Pending, Shell Station, $85,100. I nodded. That was gas. Expected. They were filling up my car. The second transaction hit at 11:15 a.m. Pending, Whole Foods Market, $412.56. I raised an eyebrow. $400 for groceries? Unless they were buying truffles and Wagyu beef, that was excessive. I clicked on the transaction details, but the itemized list wouldn't populate until the charge cleared. Still, I made a note in my ledger. Groceries, excessive. Then came the silence. For an hour, nothing appeared on the screen, and I imagined them walking through the town, the card burning a hole in Julian's pocket, the temptation growing with every store window they passed. At 12:30 p.m., the dam broke. Pending, the Vineyard Wine and Spirits, $389. I leaned back in my chair and took a sip of tea. $389 at a liquor store. That wasn't for me. I drank tea and the occasional glass of sherry. This was them stocking up on premium scotch and wine, using my money to fuel their evenings while they plotted to steal the rest. Pending. Best Buy Electronics, $1,299. I froze. A new laptop? A television? A gaming console? There was absolutely no justification for this as a household expense. This was theft, plain and simple. They were testing the boundaries, seeing if the confused old woman would notice a $1,000 charge buried in the statement. But the real smoking gun arrived at 1:15 p.m. Pending. ATM withdrawal, $500. Pending. ATM withdrawal, $510. 2 maximum withdrawals back to back. $1,000 in cash. Cash couldn't be tracked. Cash was for debts. Cash was for things they didn't want appearing on a bank statement. I picked up my pen and began to write in my evidence journal. My handwriting sharp and angular. September 19th. The audit. Access granted to household account ending in 4490. Subject: Julian Vance. Unauthorized purchases within 3 hours. Alcohol, 389 per hundred. Electronics, 1,299 Celsius. Cash. Withdrawal, $1,000. Total misappropriated funds, $2,780. I looked at the number. In less than 4 hours, they had burned through nearly $3,000 of my money. It was bold. It was reckless. It was exactly what I needed. They weren't just bad with money. They were addicts. The moment they had access to liquidity, they couldn't help themselves. They had to spend, to consume, to take. And like all addicts, they would need more. This $15,000 wouldn't last a week at this rate. And when it ran out, they would come back to me, desperate for access to the main accounts. And that was when I would have them. I heard the car return to the driveway around 3 o'clock p.m. I closed the laptop and locked the journal in the safe. I went downstairs and met them in the kitchen as they were hauling in bags. Julian looked flushed and happy, a manic energy radiating off him. Tara was wearing a new silk scarf that I hadn't seen before, likely a cash purchase from a boutique that didn't take American Express. "We got everything," Julian announced, setting a bag of groceries on the counter. "Filled the fridge, got your medications sorted out. Oh, and I picked up a few bottles of wine for dinner. I thought we could celebrate." "Celebrate what?" I asked, looking at the expensive bottle of Cabernet he was pulling out of a bag. "Just family," he said, popping the cork with a festive sound. "Being together, and you letting me help. It feels good to take care of you, Mom." I watched him pour the wine into my crystal glasses, the red liquid swirling like blood. "That's wonderful, Julian," I said, giving him a vacant smile. "Did you manage to pay the electric bill?" He paused for a fraction of a second, the glass halfway to his lips. "Oh, the bill. Yes, I'll do that online tonight. Don't you worry about a thing." I watched him drink the wine that he had bought with my money, celebrating the theft of my assets, standing in my kitchen and lying to my face. "I won't worry," I said softly. "I know everything is in good hands." I turned away to hide the expression on my face, because if he had looked closely, he would have seen that the confusion was gone, replaced by a look of predatory satisfaction. The fox wasn't in the henhouse. The fox was sitting at the kitchen table, and the chickens had just walked in and locked the door behind them. The heavy oak grandfather clock in the hallway had just struck 2 in the afternoon when the doorbell rang, slicing through the quiet tension of the house like a knife. I was sitting in the living room pretending to struggle with a simple crossword puzzle, my pen hovering over empty white squares while I listened to Julian and Tara whispering in the kitchen. They stopped talking the moment the chime echoed through the house, and Tara rushed past the doorway, smoothing her hair and checking her reflection in the hall mirror with a nervous energy that told me this was not a random caller. I heard the front door open and the murmur of low voices, one familiar and female, the other male and oily smooth, before footsteps approached the living room. Tara walked in first with a smile plastered on her face that looked like it was held in place by invisible wires, and behind her walked a man who was almost certainly not a doctor from any reputable hospital I had ever audited. He was short and balding, with a suit that was a shade too shiny under the recessed lighting, and he carried a battered leather medical bag that looked more like a prop than a tool of the trade. "Eleanor!" Tara chirped, her voice skipping an octave. "Look who dropped by. It's Dr. Eris Thorne. He's an old friend of mine from the club, and he was just in the neighborhood making house calls." I looked at Dr. Thorne over the rim of my reading glasses, and I saw a man who had struck off the register written all over his shifting eyes and damp forehead. He stepped forward and extended a hand that felt limp and clammy when I took it, and he introduced himself with a voice that sounded like gravel sliding down a chute. "Mrs. Vance," he said, holding my hand a second too long. "Tara has told me so much about you. She mentioned you've been feeling a little off lately. I thought since I was nearby I'd just pop in and do a friendly little wellness check. Totally off the books, of course. Just a favor for a friend." I knew exactly what this was because I had seen it in a dozen fraud cases before, where the family needed a quick and dirty diagnosis to expedite a legal takeover. This wasn't a medical exam. It was a rubber stamp for an incompetency hearing. I felt a surge of adrenaline spike my heart rate, but I forced my hand to go limp in his and let my mouth hang open slightly in a look of befuddled surprise. "A doctor?" I asked, my voice trembling just enough to be convincing. "But I didn't call a doctor. Is something wrong with me? Julian, why is there a doctor here?" Julian appeared in the doorway then, looking solemn and concerned as he crossed the room to stand by my chair. He put a hand on my shoulder and squeezed it gently, acting the part of the dutiful son for the benefit of their hired gun. "It's okay, Mom," he said softly. "It's just a checkup. We're all worried about your memory lapses, the stove, the money. We just want to make sure everything is firing on all cylinders." I looked from Julian to Tara, and then to the doctor, letting my eyes dart around the room like a trapped animal. I suppose," I stammered, "if you think it's best." "Excellent," Dr. Thorne said, pulling a wooden chair directly in front of me and sitting down so our knees were almost touching. "This will be very quick. Just a chat, really." As he reached down to open his bag, I slipped my right hand into the deep pocket of my cardigan where my smartphone was resting upside down. My thumb found the volume button which I had remapped to trigger the voice recorder, and I pressed it twice in quick succession until I felt the short vibration that confirmed the recording had started. "Now, Eleanor," Dr. Thorne began, pulling out a penlight and shining it in my eyes without asking permission. "Can you tell me what year it is?" This was the mini mental state examination, or at least a bastardized version of it. I blinked against the harsh light and let my gaze drift to the window as if I were searching for the answer in the gray fog outside. "The year?" I repeated slowly. "Well, it's 2024, isn't it? No, wait, is it 25? It was January 2026. I saw Dr. Thorne make a quick checkmark on his clipboard, and Tara let out a small, audible sigh of tragedy from the corner of the room. "Close," Dr. Thorne said, his tone patronizing. "And can you tell me who the President of the United States is?" I hesitated, furrowing my brow. "The President? Well, it's that man. The one from the news. With the hair. I voted for him, didn't I? Or did I vote for the other one?" I trailed off, leaving the answer hanging in the air like a piece of drift smoke. I was careful not to sound gibberish, just vague and untethered, which was far more damning than being completely incoherent. "I see," Dr. Thorne mumbled, scribbling furiously now. "And counting backward from 100 by sevens. Can you do that for me?" 100, I started confidently. 93, 80, 6, no, 85, 70, something. I stopped and looked at him with wide, fearful eyes. I used to be good with numbers. I was an accountant. Why can't I do the numbers? It's all right, Eleanor, Julian said, and I heard the genuine relief in his voice. He wasn't sad that I couldn't count. He was thrilled that the act was working. Don't stress yourself. Dr. Thorne leaned back and clicked his pen, looking at Julian and Tara with a knowing nod. Classic presentation, he said, speaking as if I wasn't even in the room. Disorientation to time, deficits in calculation and recall, general confusion. I'd say we're looking at moderate to severe cognitive decline, likely early onset dementia or Alzheimer's, though I'd need a scan to be sure. But for legal purposes, this assessment indicates she lacks the capacity to manage her own affairs. My heart hammered against my ribs with a mixture of rage and triumph. He had diagnosed me in less than 5 minutes based on 3 questions. It was malpractice of the highest order, and I had every single word of it recording in my pocket. So, what do we do? Tara asked, stepping forward with her hands clasped in faux prayer. I can sign the affidavit for the power of attorney, Thorne said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. It will state that she is medically unfit to make financial or legal decisions. That will allow you to step in immediately and freeze the assets to protect her. To protect me? I asked, piping up from my chair with a tremulous voice. Am I sick? Do I need to go to the hospital? Dr. Thorne turned back to me and gave me a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. No hospital, dear. You just need your family to take care of the hard stuff for you. You want that, don't you? To not have to worry anymore? I looked at Julian, who was staring at me with a hunger that he couldn't quite hide. Yes, I whispered, lowering my head. I suppose I do. I'm so tired of worrying. There you go, Thorne said, snapping his bag shut and standing up. I'll draw up the papers tonight and send them over. Julian, walk me to my car. Absolutely, Julian said, practically leaping at the chance. They walked out of the room, leaving me alone with Tara. She stood by the window, watching them go, and I saw her pull out her phone and type a message with rapid-fire thumbs. She was probably texting a creditor or a real estate agent. I sat there in the silence, feeling the weight of the phone in my pocket. It was hot against my leg, a burning coal of evidence. I waited until I heard the front door close and Julian's footsteps returning, before I slowly pulled my hand out of my pocket. I think I'll go take a nap, I said to Tara, standing up unsteadily. All those questions made my head hurt. You do that, Eleanor, she said dismissively, not even turning around. Rest up. You have a big day coming up. I walked out of the room and climbed the stairs, my hand gripping the banister not for support, but to keep myself from running. I made it to my bedroom and closed the door, sliding the heavy bolt home. I pulled the phone out and stopped the recording. I pressed play and listened to the first few seconds. The clear audio of Thorne's voice, the damning admission of a favor for a friend, the rushed diagnosis. It was perfect. It proved conspiracy. It proved medical fraud. It proved coercion. I connected the phone to my laptop and uploaded the file to a secure cloud server that only I had the password for. I named the file Evidence La03 Thorn.mp3. Then I walked to the window and looked down at the driveway. I saw the oil stain where Dr. Thorne's car had been parked. You should have done a scan, Doctor, I whispered to the empty glass. Because if you had looked inside my head, you would have seen that the only thing wrong with me is that I am smarter than all of you put together. I had the diagnosis. They would move fast now. They would bring the papers within days, and I would be ready to sign them, but not the papers they thought. The transformation of my home began at noon, and by 6 o'clock, the ground floor had been turned into a stage set for a play about wealth and excess that I had never auditioned for. The air, usually crisp with sea salt, was now heavy with the scents of roasting rosemary lamb, truffle oil, and the sharp, chemical tang of fresh lilies that Tara had arranged in massive, choking bouquets on every available surface. Caterers in black uniforms moved through my kitchen like a swarm of ants, unpacking crates of ingredients that had certainly not been purchased with the grocery budget I had authorized. I sat in my bedroom vanity chair while Tara stood behind me, aggressively brushing my hair with strokes that felt more like punishment than grooming. She had selected a dress for me to wear, a heavy brocade thing from the back of my closet that I hadn't worn in 20 years because it was stifling and dated. "There," she said, pinning a diamond brooch to my collar. A brooch I kept in the wall safe, which meant she had found the combination. "You look regal, Eleanor. Like a proper matriarch." I looked at my reflection. I looked like a relic. I looked like a prop to be wheeled out and displayed to prove that the family lineage was intact. "Who are these people coming tonight?" I asked, my voice wavering slightly. "I don't recall inviting anyone." "Oh, just some friends," Tara said breezily, applying a shade of lipstick to my mouth that was far too red for my complexion. "And a few of Julian's business associates. It's important for Julian to network, you know? Now that he's taking over the estate management, he needs to show that he's established." Established? That was the word for spending your mother's money on $200 bottles of wine to impress people who didn't care about you. I allowed myself to be led downstairs like a prize poodle. Julian was waiting in the foyer, holding a crystal tumbler of my best scotch, the 25-year-old single malt I had been saving for a special occasion. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him a little too tightly around the waist, and his face was flushed with the pre-game high of adrenaline and alcohol. "You look great, Mom," he said, kissing my cheek with wet lips. "Now remember, just relax. Smile. If you get tired or confused, just sit in your chair by the fire. We'll handle the conversation." "I'll try," I whispered, clutching my handbag with white-knuckled hands. Inside the bag was not a handkerchief or mints, but the small audio recorder, already running. The guests arrived in a flurry of expensive perfume and hollow laughter. There were about 12 of them, a mix of Julian's flashy, vapid friends from the city who looked at the ocean view with calculating eyes, and a few local dignitaries Julian had roped in to lend the evening an air of legitimacy. I was deposited in my wingback chair by the fireplace, a glass of sparkling water in my hand, and I watched the spectacle unfold. Julian was in his element, holding court in the center of the room, gesturing grandly with his Scotch glass as he told stories that were 90% fabrication. "Yes, it's a lot of responsibility," I heard him say to a man in a velvet blazer. "But someone has to steward the legacy. Mom has been struggling, as you can see. I've had to step in and restructure the entire portfolio to protect the assets." I took a sip of water to swallow the bile rising in my throat. Restructure the portfolio? He couldn't even balance his own checkbook. Then the doorbell rang one last time, and I saw a familiar figure enter the room. My heart gave a genuine leap of hope. It was Arthur Sterling. Arthur was Richard's oldest friend and the senior partner at the law firm that had handled our estate planning for 3 decades. He was a man of few words and immense integrity, with a face carved from granite and eyes that missed nothing. He looked uncomfortable, clutching his hat, scanning the room with a look of mild distaste until his eyes landed on me. Julian rushed over to him, oozing charm. "Arthur, so glad you could make it. I know it was last minute, but I really wanted you to see how well Mom is doing, all things considered." Arthur nodded stiffly. "Julian, I was surprised to get the call. I understood Eleanor wasn't up for visitors. Well, she has her good days and bad days, Julian said, lowering his voice to a stage whisper. Tonight is, well, she's a bit foggy, but she'll be happy to see you. Arthur walked over to me, ignoring the waiter offering him champagne. He sat on the ottoman in front of my chair and took my hand. His skin was rough and warm, a lifeline to a sanity I was pretending to have lost. Hello, Ellie, he said softly, using the nickname only Richard had used. Arthur, I said, widening my eyes and squeezing his hand with a desperate strength. Is that you? You look so old. I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes at the rudeness, but then he looked closer. He felt the specific rhythmic pressure of my thumb pressing into his palm. 3 short presses, 3 long, 3 short. SOS. It was a code Richard had taught me when we were scuba diving in the Galapagos years ago. Arthur had been on that trip. He knew the signal. His eyes sharpened instantly. He didn't pull away. He leaned in closer, blocking Julian's view with his broad shoulders. I am old, Ellie, he said, playing along, but his voice intense. We both are. How are you holding up? The tea, I mumbled, leaning forward, as if to share a secret. My eyes darting frantically to where Julian was laughing loudly near the bar. The tea tastes like gas, Arthur. And the numbers in the blue book are bleeding. It sounded like dementia rambling to anyone else, but I saw Arthur's jaw tighten. He knew I didn't have a blue book for anything other than the household account, and bleeding was an accountant's term for hemorrhaging money. The blue book? He asked quietly. Friday, I whispered, dropping the act for exactly 2 seconds, my voice clear and razor sharp. Come Friday morning. Bring the trust addendum. Do not call first. Then, as Tara approached, I slumped back into the chair and let my mouth go slack. I don't know where my knitting went, I said loudly to the ceiling. Who took my red yarn? Tara placed a hand on Arthur's shoulder, her nails digging into his suit jacket. Oh, Arthur, I'm so sorry. She gets like this when there's too much stimulation. Maybe it's best if we don't upset her. Arthur stood up slowly, his face an unreadable mask. He looked at Tara, then at Julian, and finally back at me. He nodded once, a microscopic motion that only I saw. Of course, Arthur said. I wouldn't want to upset her. I'll just pay my respects and be on my way. I have an early morning. Friday. He emphasized the word just enough. He had heard me. I watched him walk away, refusing the drink Julian tried to press into his hand. He left the house 10 minutes later, and I felt a weight lift off my chest. Arthur was the cavalry, and he was coming. The rest of the dinner was a blur of indulgence. We moved to the dining room where Julian sat at the head of the table, my husband's seat, and toasted to new beginnings. I sat at the far end, picking at my lamb and listening to them spend my money in their heads. We're thinking of remodeling the kitchen, Tara announced to the table, her eyes glittering. Open concept, all marble. The current layout is just so claustrophobic. And the boat, Julian added, his mouth full of meat. I'm looking at a 40-footer. For the family, of course. Mom loves the water. The guests nodded and smiled, eating the food that I had paid for, drinking the wine that I had cellared. They didn't see a woman being robbed. They saw a generous heir taking charge. As the dessert was served, a chocolate soufflé that collapsed the moment the spoon touched it, I decided to twist the knife one last time. Julian, I piped up, my voice cutting through the chatter. Did the dividend from the Nvidia stock clear yet? The quarterly report said it was due on the 15th. Silence fell over the table. It was a specific, lucid, financial question. Julian froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. He blinked, looking at the guests who were now looking at him, expecting an answer from the estate manager. Yes, Mom, he stammered, sweat breaking out on his forehead. Yes, of course, it cleared. It's in the main bucket. Good, I said, smiling sweetly. Because if it didn't, we'd have to liquidate the bonds to pay the capital gains tax, and you know how much I hate touching the principal. I went back to eating my soufflé. The guests looked at Julian with new eyes. I had just used complex financial terminology. I had just proven that I knew exactly what was in my portfolio. The senile mask had slipped just for a moment, and underneath was a shark. Julian laughed nervously. She has moments, he said to the table, his voice cracking. Echoes of the past. She used to be quite the accountant. I bet she was, the man in the velvet blazer said, looking at me with respect. Sounds like she still knows her stuff. The dinner ended shortly after that. The mood had shifted. The party felt less like a coronation and more like a crime scene. When the last guest had left, Julian turned on me in the hallway. His face was red, his eyes angry. What was that? He hissed. About the bonds? You embarrassed me. I just wanted to help, I whispered, shrinking away from him. I remembered Richard talking about bonds. Did I say something wrong? He stared at me, trying to find the deception, but I was gone again, hidden behind the veil of age. Go to bed, Mother, he spat. Just go to bed. I climbed the stairs, the sound of his anger music to my ears. I had humiliated him in front of his peers. I had signaled my ally, and I had confirmed that Arthur was coming on Friday. I went into my room and didn't just lock the door. I propped the chair under it again. I took out my journal and wrote one sentence. The seeds are sown. The harvest will be brutal. The opportunity arrived on Thursday morning with the innocuous chime of a text message on Julian's phone, which was sitting on the kitchen counter while he shoveled scrambled eggs into his mouth. I watched him check the screen and saw the blood drain from his face, turning his complexion the color of wet putty, before he shoved the phone into his pocket and stood up so quickly that his chair screeched against the tile floor. He told me that he and Tara had an urgent meeting with the estate planners to finalize the paperwork for my protection, but the panic in his eyes told a different story. The sharks were circling, and they were demanding a meeting in person. They left the house at 10 o'clock sharp, and I stood by the living room window watching the silver sedan speed down the driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust that hung in the damp air, like a lingering bad omen. I waited until the taillights had completely disappeared around the bend of the cliff road, and then I waited 5 minutes more, just to be absolutely certain they hadn't forgotten something. When the silence of the house finally felt heavy and settled, I turned away from the window and let the mask of the frail old woman drop from my face like a heavy garment, replaced by a look of cold and calculated purpose. I moved to the grandfather clock in the hall and opened the narrow panel in its base where Richard had always kept a small emergency toolkit hidden behind the pendulum weights. My fingers, usually stiff with the beginnings of arthritis, felt nimble and electric as I retrieved the small leather pouch containing a set of tension wrenches and lockpicks that Richard had taught me to use 40 years ago during a particularly adventurous summer we spent exploring old ruins in Europe. It was a skill I hadn't used in decades, but the muscle memory was there, dormant but not dead, waiting for a moment like this. I walked up the stairs to the guest wing, my footsteps silent on the runner, and approached the door to what used to be Richard's private study, but was now the bedroom where my son and his wife slept. I pushed the door open and was immediately assaulted by the smell of them. A cloying mixture of Tara's heavy vanilla perfume, Julian's stale cigarette smoke, and the underlying sour scent of unwashed laundry. The room was a disaster zone of discarded clothes and empty wine bottles which lay scattered across the floor, like the debris of a shipwreck, disrespecting the memory of the man who had built this house. I stepped over a pile of Tara's shoes and made my way to the closet where I had seen Julian hide his briefcase the day before. I knew he kept it locked because I had seen him fumble with a small key on his keyring every time he wanted to open it, and men like Julian only locked things when they had something to hide. I found the briefcase shoved to the back of the closet floor behind a stack of my best linens which they had pulled down from the shelves and left in a heap. It was a hard-shell Samsonite, battered and scuffed, with 2 silver latches that gleamed in the dim light of the closet. I dragged it out into the center of the room and knelt down beside it, placing my toolkit on the carpet. I took a deep breath to steady my hands and inserted the tension wrench into the keyhole of the left latch, applying a slight rotational pressure just as Richard had taught me. "Gentle, Ellie," I whispered to myself, channeling his voice. "Don't force it. Feel the pins." I slid the rake pick in and began to work the pins, listening for the subtle clicks that would tell me I was making progress. My heart was thumping against my ribs, a frantic, bird-like rhythm, because if they came back now, if they walked in and saw me on the floor with lockpicks, the charade would be over, and I would be in physical danger. The first lock gave way with a satisfying snick that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room, and I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding before moving immediately to the second latch. The second one was stubborn, the pins sticky and resistant, and sweat began to prickle along my hairline as I manipulated the metal tools. I closed my eyes and focused entirely on the tactile sensation in my fingertips, visualizing the internal mechanism of the lock, willing it to submit. Click, click, snap. The second latch popped open. I wiped my damp palms on my skirt and lifted the lid of the briefcase. Inside, there were no organized files or neat folders, just a chaotic jumble of papers that smelled of desperation. I began to sift through them, my eyes scanning the pages with the speed and precision of the forensic auditor I once was. The first document I found was a loan agreement from a private lending entity called Apex Capital, which I knew from my days in the field was a euphemism for a loan shark operation. The principal amount was staggering, $2.5 million. The interest rate was predatory, compounding weekly, and the collateral listed was not Julian's assets, but my estate, specifically the house and the land it sat on. "You fool!" I hissed, my hand trembling as I took my phone out of my pocket and snapped a clear, high-resolution photo of the document. I dug deeper and found a draft listing agreement with a local real estate agent who was known for quick, cash-only sales to developers. The listing price was set at $3 million, at least $1 million under market value for a fast close. They weren't planning to manage my estate. They were planning to liquidate it within 30 days of getting the power of attorney. They were going to sell the roof over my head for pennies on the dollar just to save their own skins. But it was the third document, buried at the very bottom of the stack, that made my blood freeze in my veins and turn to absolute ice. It was a glossy brochure for a facility called Greenwood Gardens Assisted Living. The name sounded pleasant enough, but I knew the place. It was a state-subsidized warehouse for the indigent elderly, located 2 counties over in an industrial district. It was the kind of place that smelled of urine and boiled cabbage, where residents were sedated to keep them quiet and left in hallways for hours. Paper-clipped to the brochure was an admission application, already filled out in Tara's handwriting. Reason for admission: severe dementia safety risk. Funding source: Medicaid, state aid. Proposed admission. Date: October 1st. October 1st was 2 weeks away. They weren't just stealing my money. They were disposing of me. They planned to sell my home, take every penny of the equity to pay off the sharks, and dump me in a hellhole to rot and die alone while they disappeared with what was left. I felt a wave of nausea so violent I had to lean back on my heels and put my head between my knees to keep from fainting. The betrayal was absolute. It went beyond greed. It was a profound and visceral cruelty that shattered whatever tiny fragment of maternal love I had been holding on to. No, I whispered into the carpet, and the word was a vow. No. I sat up and wiped the cold sweat from my face. I was not a victim. I was not a piece of trash to be thrown away. I was Eleanor Vance, and I had brought down corporate CEOs who were smarter and richer than these two parasites. I photographed the brochure. I photographed the application. I photographed the real estate listing. I took pictures of every single damning piece of paper in that briefcase, ensuring the lighting was clear and the text was legible. Then, with hands that were suddenly steady as rock, I began to reconstruct the crime scene. I placed the brochure at the bottom, followed by the listing agreement, followed by the loan shark papers. I closed the lid and pressed the latches down until they clicked shut. I relocked them using the picks, reversing the tension until the tumblers fell back into place. I pushed the briefcase back into the dark corner of the closet. I restacked the linens exactly as they had been, matching the fold lines. I backed out of the closet and smoothed the carpet fibers where my knees had made indentations. I stood in the center of the room and did a final visual sweep. Everything was exactly as it had been. The chaos was undisturbed. I left the room and closed the door, wiping the handle with the sleeve of my cardigan to remove any prints. I walked back to the grandfather clock and returned the toolkit to its hiding place, the metal clicking softly against the wood. I went into the kitchen and made myself a cup of tea, but I didn't drink it. I stood by the sink and stared out at the ocean, watching the gray waves batter the cliffs. I had been playing a game of chess, maneuvering pieces, setting traps. But now I realized this wasn't chess. This was war. They were planning to end my life, not by stopping my heart, but by stripping away my humanity. I heard the sound of the car returning, the tires crunching on the gravel. I didn't flinch. I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold, hard resolve that was stronger than anything I had ever felt in my life. I walked to the foyer as the front door opened. Julian walked in, looking haggard and stressed, while Tara looked annoyed. "Did you have a nice time?" I asked, my voice light and airy, the perfect picture of the oblivious mother. "It was just business, Mom," Julian grunted, loosening his tie. "Boring stuff." "Well," I said, smiling at him with eyes that were hard as diamonds. "I'm glad you're back. I was just thinking about the future." "The future?" Tara asked, looking at me suspiciously. "Yes," I said. "I was thinking about how important it is to be secure, to be in the right place." Julian exchanged a look with Tara, a look of smug anticipation. They thought I was talking about the nursing home. They thought I was ready to go. "We'll make sure you're secure, Mom," Julian said. "Don't you worry." "Oh, I'm not worried, Julian," I said, turning back toward the kitchen. "I'm not worried at all. I had the photos, I had the recordings, I had the date. And on Friday, I would have the pen. The adrenaline that had fueled my break-in of the briefcase had long since evaporated, leaving behind a hollow ache in my chest that felt less like fear and more like mourning. I couldn't stay in the house with them. Not while the image of that nursing home brochure was still burned into my retinas, and not while Julian was whistling in the kitchen as if he hadn't just signed my death warrant. I wrapped myself in my thickest wool coat, the one Richard had bought me in Ireland, and slipped out the French doors, telling Tara I needed fresh air for my dizzy spells. I walked down the stone path that wound through the overgrown hydrangeas to the edge of the property where the land dropped away sharply into the Pacific Ocean. There was a weathered teak bench there, bolted into the granite, facing the endless gray horizon where the sea met the sky. It was the place where Richard and I had sat on the morning we found out I was pregnant with Julian, and it was the place where I had sat alone the morning after Richard died. I carried a small, battered shoebox under my arm, its corners worn white with age. It wasn't the evidence file. That was safely encrypted in the cloud. This was the other file, the one that held the prosecution's defense, the one I needed to review before I passed the final sentence. I sat on the bench, and the cold wind whipped my hair across my face, stinging my cheeks and making my eyes water, though I suspect the tears would have come regardless of the weather. I opened the box and the wind threatened to snatch the papers away, so I held them down with a gloved hand, treating them as if they were more valuable than the stock certificates in my safe. I picked up a photograph first. It was a Polaroid from 1985. Julian was 7 years old, missing a front tooth, standing on this very lawn, holding a kite that was bigger than he was. I remembered that day with a clarity that hurt. He had crashed the kite 3 times and cried, but I had helped him tape it back together. And when it finally flew, he had looked at me with pure, unadulterated adoration and said, "You fixed it, Mommy. You can fix anything." I ran my thumb over his smiling face. Where had that boy gone? When did the child who cried over a broken kite turn into the man who would lock his mother in a state-run facility to pay off a gambling debt? I dug deeper into the box and pulled out a letter, written on lined notebook paper in sloppy cursive. It was from his first year at boarding school. "Dear Mom and Dad, I hate it here. The other boys are mean and the food is bad. Please let me come home. I promise I'll be good. I miss the ocean and I miss you. Love, Jay." We hadn't let him come home. We thought we were building his character. We thought we were teaching him resilience. Was this my fault? Had I created this monster by giving him too much, or by not giving him enough of the right things? The guilt was a heavy stone in my gut, the eternal burden of the mother who wonders where the path diverged. But then my hand brushed against a different envelope, one made of heavy, cream-colored stationery with a familiar, confident script on the front. To Eleanor. It was the letter Richard had written me 2 weeks before he died. He knew his heart was failing, though he hadn't told Julian. He had only told me. I pulled the single sheet of paper out, and the sound of Richard's voice filled my head, drowning out the crash of the waves. "My dearest Elle," it read, "if you are reading this, I am gone, and the silence in the house is probably deafening. I need you to promise me something. We both know Julian has a weakness in him, a hunger for things he hasn't earned. I have tried to steer him, but some tides are too strong. You are the guardian of this legacy now. Do not let your love for the boy blind you to the nature of the man. If the day comes when he tries to tear down what we built, you must be the wall. You are stronger than you think, my silver fox. Protect our home. Protect yourself." I lowered the letter, my hand trembling uncontrollably. Richard had known. He had seen the cracks in the foundation years ago, even when I had chosen to ignore them. He had seen the greed in Julian's eyes when he asked about the inheritance, the laziness in his work ethic, the entitlement that rotted his ambition. I looked out at the ocean, which churned and boiled against the rocks below. The water didn't care about my grief. It didn't care about mothers and sons. It just was, powerful, relentless, and enduring. I realized then that the Julian I was mourning, the boy with the kite, the homesick student, was already dead. He had died years ago, slowly replaced by the desperate, soulless stranger currently drinking my wine in my kitchen. The man in the house wasn't my son. He was a parasite wearing my son's face. If I let him win, I wouldn't just be losing my money. I would be betraying Richard. I would be destroying the very thing we had spent 40 years building. To save the legacy, I had to cut out the rot. I felt a sob rip through my chest, a jagged, ugly sound that was swallowed by the wind. I cried for the baby I had nursed. I cried for the graduations I had attended. I cried for the hope I had held on to until this very morning. I let the grief wash over me like a tidal wave, drowning me in the sorrow of what had to be done. I sat there for an hour until my tears ran dry and my hands were numb from the cold. Then, slowly, I began to put the photos and letters back into the box. I placed the picture of the boy with the kite at the very bottom, face down. I placed Richard's letter on top, face up. I closed the lid. I stood up and brushed the damp leaves from my coat. The heaviness in my chest had settled into something cold and hard, like a layer of steel plating around my heart. The mother who would have forgiven him was gone, left on that bench beside the ghost of her husband. I turned back toward the house. It stood on the hill, glowing with warm yellow light against the darkening sky. It looked beautiful and inviting, but I knew it was a battlefield. I walked up the path, my stride lengthening, my back straightening. I was done crying. I was done wondering if I was doing the right thing. They wanted a fight? They wanted to play games with my life? I reached the patio door and saw them through the glass. They were sitting on the sofa, laughing at something on the television, comfortable and complacent. They looked like the owners of the house. I opened the door and stepped inside, the warmth of the room hitting my cold face. "Oh, you're back," Tara said, not looking away from the screen. "Feeling better?" "Much better," I said, and my voice was steady and devoid of any tremble. The fresh air cleared my head completely. "That's good," Julian said, yawning. "You should get some rest, Mom. Big day tomorrow. We need to get you ready for the signing on Friday." "Yes," I said, walking past them toward the stairs. "Friday will be a very big day." I went up to my room and placed the shoebox on the top shelf of my closet, pushing it all the way to the back where I wouldn't have to see it. I washed my face in the bathroom sink, scrubbing away the salt and the tear tracks until my skin was pink and raw. I looked in the mirror. The eyes staring back were dry. I was ready to pull the trigger. The storm that had been threatening the coast for 2 days finally broke on Thursday morning, unleashing a torrential downpour that turned the ocean into a churning cauldron of gunmetal gray and lashed against the windows of the manor with a violence that felt personal. The house groaned under the assault, the wind whistling through the eaves like a chorus of disapproving ghosts. But inside the kitchen, the atmosphere was quiet and heavy with a different kind of pressure. I sat at the small breakfast table by the bay window. My posture deliberately slumped, staring into a mug of herbal tea that had gone cold 20 minutes ago. I had spent an hour in front of the mirror before coming downstairs. carefully applying a foundation that was 2 shades too pale for my skin tone and foregoing my usual blush, creating a visage of fragility and exhaustion that required no acting to maintain. I had let my hair hang slightly limp and unstyled, and I wore a loose-fitting beige cardigan that seemed to swallow my frame, making me look smaller and more withered than I actually was. Julian and Tara were moving around the kitchen with a restless energy, the tension of the impending deadline radiating off them in waves. I could hear the sharp clatter of a spoon against a ceramic bowl as Tara furiously mixed pancake batter, and the rhythmic tapping of Julian's foot against the floorboards where he stood by the coffee machine, checking his watch for the 3rd time in as many minutes. They were waiting for me to break, waiting for the final crumble of the foundation that would allow them to rush in and claim the rubble. I took a shallow, shaky breath, letting the sound of it catch in my throat loud enough for them to hear. "Julian," I said, my voice barely rising above the sound of the rain drumming against the glass. The tapping stopped instantly. "Yes, Mom?" he asked, turning toward me with a speed that betrayed his eagerness. I kept my gaze fixed on the swirling dark liquid in my mug, refusing to meet his eyes just yet. I had a bad night again," I lied, injecting a tremor into my words. "I woke up, and I didn't know where I was. For a moment, I thought I was back in the apartment in the city, the one we lived in before you were born. I was looking for your father." I looked up at him then, letting my eyes fill with the fear of a mind losing its anchor. "I'm scared, Julian. I'm scared of what I might do. The stove, the money, the missing keys. I don't trust myself anymore." Tara abandoned the pancakes and came to stand beside Julian, her face composed into a mask of tragic sympathy that didn't quite cover the gleam of anticipation in her eyes. "Oh, Eleanor," she cooed, "that sounds terrifying." "It is," I whispered. "I don't want to be a danger to myself, and I don't want to be a burden to you. I heard you talking about the stress of managing everything. I don't want to be the reason you're unhappy." "You're not a burden, Mom," Julian said, stepping closer and placing a hand on the table. "We just want you to be safe. That's all we've ever wanted." "I know," I said, reaching out and covering his hand with my cold, dry fingers. "And that's why I think you were right about the power of attorney, about taking over." The silence that followed was absolute, heavier than the storm outside. I could practically hear their hearts skipping a beat, the sudden rush of dopamine flooding their brains. They had won. The siege was over. You think so?" Julian asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes," I said, nodding slowly. "I can't manage the estate. It's too complex. The numbers just swim in my head now. I want you to have the authority. I want to sign everything over to you so I can just rest." Julian looked at Tara and a smile broke across his face, a genuine, unguarded grin of pure greed. "That's a very brave decision, Mom, and a smart one. I can handle it. I promise I'll take care of everything." "I know you will," I said softly. "But we need to do it right. I don't want the bank to contest it later. You know how sticky they can be about elder transfers." "We have the papers Dr. Thorne sent over," Tara interjected quickly. "We can just sign them right here. We can get a notary to come to the house today." I shook my head weakly. "No, not a mobile notary. The bank won't like that. It needs to be official. It needs to be handled by the family attorney. It needs to be Arthur." Julian's face tightened slightly. "Arthur? But he seemed a bit stiff at the party. Do we really need him involved?" "He's the executor of the trust, Julian," I explained, leaning back in my chair as if the conversation was exhausting me. If we don't do it through him, the Board of Trustees will freeze the assets for an audit. You don't want that, do you? An audit takes months. The threat of an audit and the delay of their payday worked exactly as I knew it would. Julian paled. No audit. We need this clean. Exactly, I said. So I called Arthur's office this morning, before I came down. You called him? Julian asked, a flicker of alarm in his eyes. Yes, I said, keeping my voice dreamy and vague. I told him I was ready to retire. I told him my son was going to take care of me now. He agreed it was for the best, considering my condition at the dinner party. Julian relaxed, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. He thought he had fooled Arthur too. He thought my performance at the dinner had convinced the lawyer that I was incompetent. Okay, Julian said, letting out a long breath. Okay, that's good. So, what did he say? He's coming tomorrow, I said. Friday at 10 a.m. He's bringing the transfer documents. He said he just needs to witness my signature and yours, and then it's all yours. Friday at 10, Julian repeated, savoring the words. Tomorrow. Yes, I said, closing my eyes. And then I can just stop worrying. Maybe I can go somewhere quiet, somewhere where I can't hurt anyone. We'll find the perfect place for you, Mom, Tara said, squeezing my shoulder. A place where you'll be treated like a queen. Like a prisoner, I corrected in my head, thinking of the Greenwood Gardens brochure. I think I need to go lie down, I said, pushing myself up from the table with a groan of effort. I feel very drained. Go ahead, Mom, Julian said, practically ushering me out of the room. Sleep as long as you want. We'll handle everything down here. I walked slowly out of the kitchen, trailing my hand along the wall for support until I turned the corner into the hallway. The moment I was out of their line of sight, I straightened my spine. I didn't go upstairs, though. I moved silently into the small coat closet under the stairs, leaving the door cracked just a fraction of an inch. I needed to hear the victory lap. It took less than 10 seconds. Oh my God! Tara squealed, her voice muffled by the walls but still audible. It's happening! It's actually happening! I told you! Julian shouted, and I heard the sound of a hand slapping a countertop. I told you she would fold! She knows she's losing it! Did you see her face? She looks like a walking corpse. Tomorrow, Tara breathed. By noon tomorrow, we'll have control. We can wire the money to Apex by 1 p.m. We can save the condo. Forget the condo, Julian scoffed. With the power of attorney, we can sell this place. I already texted the agent $3 million, cash offer. We take the money, pay the debt, and we still have $500,000 to play with. And her? Tara asked. What if Arthur asks about her living arrangements? We tell him she's staying here, Julian said, his voice dropping to a callous, dismissive tone. Then, once the papers are filed and the house is sold, we move her to Greenwood. It's fully legal. The doctor signed off. We're just following medical advice for her safety. God, I need a drink, Tara laughed. Open the champagne, the good stuff. I stood in the dark closet, listening to the pop of the cork and the clinking of glasses. I listened to them toast to my demise. I listened to my son laugh about selling his childhood home and discarding his mother like a broken toy. I felt a coldness settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the drafty closet. It was the absolute zero of emotional detachment. Any lingering doubt, any shred of guilt I might have felt about what I was going to do to them tomorrow, was incinerated in that moment. They were celebrating a victory that hadn't happened yet. They were toasting a ghost. I slipped out of the closet and ghosted up the stairs, the sound of their laughter following me like a taunt. I entered my study and locked the door. Not with the flimsy privacy lock, but with the deadbolt I had installed myself years ago. I moved to the large safe hidden behind the portrait of the coastline in the corner. I spun the dial, left to 40, right to 12, left to 88. The heavy steel door swung open with a silent glide. I bypassed the jewelry and the cash. I reached into the back and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope that I had prepared days ago, anticipating this moment. Inside were the documents that Arthur and I had drafted via encrypted email over the last 48 hours. They looked identical to the standard power of attorney forms. They had the same headers, the same font, the same legal jargon. But the clauses were different. I sat at my desk and pulled out my tablet. I had one final message to send. I opened the secure messaging app and typed, "To Arthur Sterling. Status: the trap is set. They have accepted the meeting for Friday, 10 a.m. They believe you are coming to facilitate their takeover. They are completely unguarded. Instruction: bring the decoy folder for the table. Keep the real folder in your briefcase until I give the signal. Signal: I will ask for a glass of water." I hit send and watched the message vanish into the digital ether. The rain hammered against the window, a relentless drumbeat of war. I looked at the calendar on my desk. Friday, September 21st. Tomorrow, Julian thought he was walking into a coronation. He didn't know he was walking into a guillotine. I spent the rest of the afternoon in the study, not resting, but rehearsing. I went over every line of the law, every potential objection, every loophole they might try to exploit. I practiced my confused face in the mirror, refining the tremor in my hand, the vacant look in my eyes. But behind the vacant look, my mind was a razor. Night fell, and the storm raged on. I heard Julian and Tara come up the stairs, stumbling slightly, their voices loud and slurred from a day of premature celebration. They went into the guest room, and I heard them laughing, the sound muffled and ugly. I turned off the lamp on my desk and sat in the darkness, listening to the house. "Enjoy your night," I whispered to the dark. "It's the last peaceful sleep you're going to have." I laid the trap documents out on the desk, aligning them perfectly. The stage was set. The actors were in place. All that was left was to drop the curtain. The storm outside had exhausted itself by 3 a.m., leaving behind a silence so deep and heavy that the house felt like it was holding its breath. I sat at my desk in the study, the only light coming from the green banker's lamp, which cast a pool of illumination onto the leather blotter where my life's work lay, spread out in neat, terrifying stacks. Upstairs, I could hear the faint, rhythmic vibration of Julian's snoring, a sound that used to comfort me when he was a baby, but now sounded like the growl of a predator sleeping off a heavy meal. I picked up my magnifying glass, the brass handle cool against my palm, and leaned over the documents that Arthur had couriered over secretly the evening before, disguised inside a delivery of gourmet tea. To the untrained eye, and Julian's eye was untrained, lazy, and blinded by greed, these papers looked exactly like the standard durable power of attorney and asset transfer forms that any estate lawyer would draft. They had the correct watermarks, the dense blocks of legalese, and the intimidating stamps of the state notary board. But words are like numbers. If you change their order just slightly, the entire equation shifts. I ran my finger down the text of Clause 14, Transfer of Liabilities. Most people skip the liability clauses. They only look for the assets section. But Clause 14 was the trapdoor. It stated, in dense, circular legal language, that by assuming control of the Vance family estate, The signatory, Julian, also assumed immediate and personal responsibility for all outstanding debts, liens, and encumbrances held by the principal, me, as well as any debts incurred by the signatory in anticipation of this transfer. I smiled, a thin, cold curving of my lips. Julian thought he was inheriting a $4 million house. He didn't realize that I had legally encumbered the house yesterday afternoon by placing a restrictive covenant on the deed, donating the development rights to a land conservancy. The house could not be sold for commercial development. It could not be flipped. Its market value to a developer was now effectively zero. If Julian signed this, he wasn't getting a windfall. He was getting a house he couldn't sell and a legal acknowledgement that his debts to the loan sharks were now tied to a property he couldn't liquidate. But that was just the jab. The knockout punch was in the second document. The Irrevocable Trust Amendment. I pulled the second stack of papers closer. This was the document Julian believed was the direct transfer of my liquid cash. The stocks, the bonds, the savings. He thought this paper moved the money from my name to his. I adjusted my glasses and read the fine print of Schedule B. Upon the execution of this agreement, all liquid assets currently held by Eleanor Vance shall be transferred to the Vance Integrity Fund. Julian would assume the Vance Integrity Fund was just a shell company I had set up for him. He wouldn't read the appendix on page 42, which defined the Vance Integrity Fund as a charitable entity dedicated to the support of victims of elder abuse, with Arthur Sterling as the sole trustee. If Julian signed this, he was literally donating his inheritance to charity with his own hand. I picked up the stapler. The sound of the metal staple crunching through the thick cotton bond paper was satisfyingly final. Ker-chunk. I prepared 2 folders. The first was a navy blue leather folio. This contained the real documents, the ones described above. I placed sticky sign here flags on the signature lines, carefully positioning them so that they lifted the eye away from the dangerous text and focused it only on the blank line waiting for his name. I knew Julian. He wouldn't read. He would see the flag, see the dollar signs in his head, and sign. The second was a red folder. This contained the decoy documents, the harmless drafts that we would leave on the table for him to glance at while we drank coffee. They were simple, standard, and safe. At the critical moment, Arthur would perform the switch, a sleight of hand we had practiced with documents a dozen times in corporate boardrooms during the 80s. I placed the folders side by side. Blue for the signature, red for the show. I stood up and walked to the window. The sky was beginning to bruise with the first purple light of dawn. The ocean was calm now, a flat sheet of steel under the rising sun. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were preparing a surgery on a patient I didn't know. I wasn't a mother anymore. I wasn't a widow. I was the auditor, and the books were about to be balanced. I went to the small safe in the floor of the closet and retrieved the evidence file, the recordings of the gas stove incident, the photos of the loan shark papers, the nursing home brochure. I placed them in a sealed manila envelope marked Exhibit A. This would stay in my lap. If Julian hesitated, if he read the fine print, if the trap failed, I would open this envelope and threaten to call the district attorney right there in the dining room. It was the nuclear option. I checked the clock. 6 a.m. I needed to set the stage. I needed to look weaker than I had ever looked in my life. I went into the bathroom and washed my hair, leaving it wet and stringy. I found an old lipstick that had turned slightly rancid and dabbed it on my cheeks, smudging it to look like a clumsy attempt at grooming. I put on mismatched socks. I unbuttoned the second button of my blouse and buttoned it into the third hole, creating a subtle, disheveled misalignment. I looked in the mirror. The woman staring back was a tragedy. She looked confused, neglected, and ready to be committed. Perfect, I whispered. I went downstairs to the kitchen. I didn't make coffee. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the dark at the kitchen table, staring at the wall, waiting for them to find me. At 7:30 a.m., I heard them stirring. Footsteps, heavy and hungover, thudded on the ceiling. Water ran in the pipes. Julian came down first. He looked terrible. Eyes puffy, skin gray, wearing a suit that looked like he had slept in it. But there was a manic energy vibrating off him. "Mom?" he asked, squinting into the gloom of the kitchen. "Why are you sitting in the dark?" I turned my head slowly, counting to 3 before answering. I was waiting for the bus, Julian." "The bus?" He laughed, a nervous barking sound. "There's no bus here, Mom. We're in the house, remember? Today is the big day. Arthur is coming." "Arthur?" I blinked, feigning a struggle to recall the name. "Oh, the nice man with the hat. Yes. Is he bringing the check?" "No, Mom," Julian said, walking over and turning on the lights, making me wince theatrically. "He's bringing the papers so I can take care of the checks, remember?" "Right," I mumbled, looking down at my hands. "You take care of the checks. I'm just so tired of the math. The numbers hurt my eyes." Tara waltzed in then, wearing a sharp black dress that looked more appropriate for a funeral than a morning meeting. She saw me and smirked. "She looks ready," Tara whispered to Julian, loud enough for me to hear. "Look at her shirt. She can barely dress herself." "Good," Julian whispered back. "Let's get some coffee in her. We need her awake enough to hold a pen, but not awake enough to talk." They moved around me, preparing the kitchen, setting out mugs, checking the time. 8, 9 a.m. I sat there, the Exhibit A envelope resting on my knees under the table, my hand clutching the fabric of my skirt. At 9:55 a.m., the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the house like a gavel striking a sounding block. Julian jumped. He smoothed his tie, ran a hand through his hair, and took a deep breath. "Showtime," he muttered. "Go get the door, Julian," Tara said, her eyes gleaming. I stood up, my legs shaking, partly an act, partly real adrenaline. "I'll go," I said. "I want to let Arthur in." "No, Mom, you sit," Julian started to say. "I want to let him in," I snapped, a flash of senile aggression that made them both step back. "He's my friend." Okay, Julian said, holding up his hands. "You let him in. We'll be right here." I shuffled to the foyer. I reached for the heavy brass handle. I could see Arthur's silhouette through the frosted glass. I paused for 1 second. I looked back at Julian and Tara standing in the kitchen doorway, smiling like sharks who smell blood in the water. I opened the door. Arthur stood there. He was wearing his charcoal gray litigation suit, the one he wore when he was going to court. He held a thick leather briefcase in his left hand. He looked at me. His eyes were hard, intelligent, and fierce. "Good morning, Eleanor," he said formally. I leaned in for a hug, and as my cheek pressed against his rough jacket, I whispered 2 words into his ear. "It's time." The dining room table, a long expanse of polished mahogany that had hosted Christmas dinners and birthday parties for 40 years, now felt like an executioner's block as we gathered around it in a stiff and unnatural tableau. The morning light, filtered through the high windows, was cold and unforgiving, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air and the sheen of nervous sweat on Julian's forehead as he pulled out the heavy oak chair at the head of the table for Arthur. The room smelled of old wax and the sharp, metallic tang of the fresh ink from the documents that Arthur was slowly, maddeningly slowly, removing from his leather briefcase. I sat to Arthur's right, huddled in my beige cardigan, my hands gripping a crumpled tissue as if it were a talisman against the encroaching confusion I was pretending to feel. Tara sat opposite me, her posture rigid and predatory, her eyes flicking between Arthur's hands and my face, assessing the threat level of every movement. Julian remained standing, pacing back and forth behind his wife's chair like a caged tiger, his energy too frantic to be contained by a seat. "Please, sit down, Julian," Arthur said, his voice a deep baritone that commanded the room without raising in volume. "This is a formal legal proceeding. I need all parties seated and focused." Julian stopped pacing and let out a huff of impatience, running a hand through his disheveled hair before scraping a chair back and dropping into it heavily. "We're focused, Arthur," he said, checking his watch for the 10th time. "We just want to get this done. Mom is tired. We don't want to drag this out." "These are significant documents, Julian," Arthur replied, peering over his half-moon spectacles with a look of severe disapproval. "They transfer total control of the Vance estate, including all real property, liquid assets, and decision-making powers, from Eleanor to yourself. The law requires that I explain the gravity of this to your mother." "She knows the gravity," Tara interjected, her voice smooth and syrupy. "We've discussed it at length, haven't we, Eleanor?" I looked up, letting my head wobble slightly on my neck. "Discussed what?" I asked, keeping my voice thin and reedy. The house? Are we selling the house?" Julian slammed his hand on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. "No, Mom, we are not selling the house. We are saving it, remember? You're signing it to me so I can pay the bills." I flinched away from the noise, shrinking into my chair. "Don't yell," I whispered. "Please don't yell. My head hurts." "I'm not yelling," Julian hissed through gritted teeth, his face reddening. "Just listen to Arthur." Arthur watched this exchange with eyes that were cold and sharp as flint. He opened the red folder, the decoy folder, and spread the papers out on the table. These were the innocent drafts, the ones that looked standard and safe. "Eleanor," Arthur said, turning his body toward me and ignoring Julian completely. "Do you understand that by signing these papers, you are giving up your right to manage your own money? You will no longer have access to your checkbook. You will not be able to make decisions about your medical care. Julian will have the final say." I looked at the papers, letting my eyes glaze over as I stared at the dense blocks of text. I just want the numbers to stop swimming," I mumbled. "I can't do the math anymore, Arthur. The tax man, he's going to come for me." "There is no tax man coming for you, Mom," Julian groaned. "Just sign the papers so we can protect you." Arthur looked at me, and I saw the microscopic question in his eyes. He was waiting for the signal. He needed to know that I was ready to swap the harmless red folder for the lethal blue one. I coughed, a dry hacking sound that racked my small frame. I touched my throat with a trembling hand. "I'm so dry," I rasped, looking at Julian with pleading eyes. "My throat, it feels like sand. Can I have some water, Julian? Ice water?" Julian rolled his eyes and threw his hands up. "Now? You want water now?" "Please," I whispered. "Just a small glass." "I'll get it," Tara said, starting to rise. "No," I said, a little too sharply, before quickly softening my tone. "I want Julian to get it. He knows which glass I like. The crystal one." Julian let out a curse under his breath and stood up, scraping his chair back again. Fine. I'll get the damn water. Don't touch anything." He stomped out of the room toward the kitchen. Tara watched him go, her attention momentarily broken. She pulled out her phone to check a notification, perhaps from the loan shark, distracted by the proximity of her victory. In that split second of distraction, Arthur moved with the speed of a magician. He slid the red folder back into his briefcase and, in the same fluid motion, pulled out the navy blue folio, the real documents with the poison pill clauses and the trust transfer. He placed it on the table exactly where the red one had been, opening it to the signature page, which was marked with bright yellow "Sign Here" flags that obscured the text of the liability acceptance clause. It took less than 3 seconds. By the time Tara looked back up, Arthur was simply adjusting his glasses, his hands folded calmly over the blue folder. Julian returned with the water, slamming the crystal glass down on a coaster in front of me. Water sloshed over the rim and stained the wood, but no one cared. "There," Julian said. "Water. Now, can we sign?" I took the glass with 2 hands, making it shake so the ice cubes clinked against the crystal. A sound of frailty. I took a small sip and nodded. "Thank you, Julian," I said softly. "You're a good boy." Arthur pushed the blue folder toward me. He uncapped a heavy black fountain pen, an instrument of weight and consequence, and held it out to me. "Eleanor," Arthur said, his voice solemn, "if you are sure, you need to sign on the line marked Principal. Press hard. It is in triplicate." I took the pen. It felt heavy and cold in my hand. I looked at the line. Above it, hidden by the yellow flag, were the words that would strip Julian of everything he thought he was gaining. I hesitated. I let the nib hover over the paper, shaking. I don't know," I whimpered. "It's so permanent, Arthur. What if I want to buy a new hat? Or a gift for a friend?" "For God's sake, Mom!" Julian shouted, leaning over the table, his patience finally snapping. "You don't need to buy hats. You have enough hats. Just sign the paper. Do you want to go to the state home? Is that what you want? Because if you don't sign this, we can't afford to keep you here." The threat hung in the air, ugly and naked. Tara gasped softly, knowing he had gone too far, but Julian didn't care. He was desperate. Arthur stiffened. "Mr. Vance, I must advise you that coercing a signee is—" "I'm not coercing her," Julian yelled, his face inches from mine. "I'm telling her the truth. Sign it, Mom. Now." I looked at him, letting tears pool in my eyes. I wanted this moment recorded in Arthur's memory forever. I wanted the lawyer to witness the absolute lack of love in my son's heart. "Okay," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Okay, Julian. I'll do it. I'll do it for you." I lowered the pen. I pressed the nib to the paper. Scratch, scratch, scratch. I wrote my name slowly, with a shaky, looping script that looked nothing like my usual sharp signature. Eleanor Margaret Vance. I lifted the pen and looked at Julian. "There," I said. "Is that right?" Julian let out a breath that sounded like a tire deflating. He sagged against the table, a grin spreading across his face. "Yes, Mom. That's perfect." "Not yet," Arthur said, his voice cutting through Julian's relief. "The transfer is reciprocal. You must sign, Julian. You are accepting the duties of the power of attorney and the structure of the estate." Arthur turned the folder toward Julian. He pointed to the line below mine, marked Agent. Julian didn't even read the header. He didn't read the paragraph above the line that said, "I, the undersigned, accept full personal liability for all encumbrances attached to the Vance estate." He just grabbed the pen from my hand. Give me that, he said. He signed his name with a flourish. Big, bold, arrogant letters. Julian Vance. He capped the pen and tossed it onto the table. It rolled across the mahogany and hit the water glass with a soft tink. Done, Julian said, beaming at Tara. It's done. Arthur pulled the folder back. He checked the signatures. He pulled out his notary stamp from his pocket. Thump, thump. He embossed the seal onto the paper, locking the contract in ironclad legality. Yes, Arthur said, closing the blue folder and sliding it into his briefcase. The click of the briefcase latch snapping shut sounded like a jail cell door closing. It is done. Julian let out a whoop of joy. I need a drink, he said, turning to Tara. Open the champagne. The real champagne. Tara stood up, her eyes shining. I'll get it. Arthur, will you stay for a toast? Arthur stood up, picking up his briefcase. He looked at Julian, and for the first time, he allowed a look of utter contempt to cross his face. No, Arthur said. I have to file these with the county clerk immediately. Time is of the essence. Of course, Julian said, waving a hand dismissively. You go do your filing. Just make sure the funds are released to the main account by noon. I have transfers to make. The funds will be exactly where they are supposed to be, Arthur said. He turned to me. Goodbye, Eleanor. Goodbye, Arthur, I said, still clutching the water glass. Thank you for coming. Arthur nodded and walked out of the room. We heard the front door open and close. The silence that followed was broken only by Julian's laughter. He walked over to me and kissed me on the forehead, but his eyes were looking over my shoulder at the imaginary pile of money he thought he just won. You did good, Mom, he said. You did really good. Now, why don't you go upstairs? Tara and I have a lot of calls to make. We need to organize the management strategy. Go upstairs? I asked. Yes, he said, turning away and pulling out his phone. Go rest. You look exhausted. I stood up slowly. My legs felt strong again. The shaking in my hands had stopped. I think I will, I said. I have some things to organize, too. I walked to the doorway of the dining room and paused. Julian was already dialing a number, probably the loan shark. Tara was popping the cork on a bottle of Dom Perignon. They didn't look at me. I was furniture to them now. A problem that had been solved. I walked up the stairs, but I didn't go to my bedroom. I went to the guest room, their room. I stood in the center of the room and looked at the closet where the briefcase was hidden. I looked at the unmade bed. I checked my watch. It was 10:45 a.m. Arthur would be filing the papers electronically from his car in 5 minutes. By 11:00 a.m., the house would be legally encumbered. By 11:05 a.m., my liquid assets would be draining out of the accounts Julian had access to and flowing into the charitable trust. By 11:30 a.m., Julian would try to make a transfer to Apex Capital, and by 11:31 a.m., the card would be declined. I walked back out to the landing and stood by the railing, looking down into the foyer. I waited. I wasn't the confused old woman anymore. I was the executioner, and I was just waiting for the guillotine blade to drop. I stood at the top of the grand staircase, hidden in the shadows of the landing, looking down into the sun-drenched foyer like a gargoyle perched on a cathedral. Below me, the house was alive with the sounds of a premature victory celebration. The sharp pop of a champagne cork, the fizzy rush of liquid-filling crystal flutes, and the ugly braying laughter of my son and his wife. They were toasting to their own cleverness, clinking glasses over the corpse of my independence, completely unaware that the ink on the documents they had just signed was already drying into a cage of their own making. I checked the analog watch on my wrist, the second hand sweeping past the 12. It was 11:30 a.m. Downstairs, the mood shifted from celebratory to transactional. I heard Julian clear his throat and the heavy thud of him setting his glass down on the antique console table. "All right," he said, his voice booming with the false confidence of a man playing with house money. "Let's get this done. I'm calling Apex. I want that debt cleared before lunch so we can focus on the listing agent." "Do it on speaker," Tara urged, her voice tight with excitement. "I want to hear them grovel when they realize we actually have the cash." I leaned forward, gripping the banister. This was the moment, the turn of the screw. I heard the beep of the keypad as Julian dialed. The line rang twice, a hollow electronic trill that echoed in the high-ceilinged space. "Yeah, it's Vance," Julian said, dropping into a tough guy cadence that sounded ridiculous coming from him. Yeah, hold your horses. I told you I'd have it. I'm logging into the portal now. I'm wiring the full 2.5, plus the vigorish. I want a confirmation email the second it clears. You understand? I want to be done with you people." There was a pause, presumably while the loan shark on the other end gave a skeptical grunt. "Just watch the screen," Julian snapped. "I'm hitting send. Now." Silence descended on the house. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the sound of Julian's finger tapping the screen of his tablet. Tap, then a pause. Tap, tap. "What the hell?" Julian muttered. "What is it?" Tara asked, the ice in her glass clinking. "It says, transaction failed," Julian said, his voice confused. "Insufficient funds." "Don't be stupid," Tara laughed nervously. "It's a multi-million-dollar account. Try it again. You probably typed the routing number wrong." "I didn't type it wrong," Julian snapped. "I'm trying it again. Sending." Tap. I closed my eyes and imagined the digital signal racing through the fiber optic cables, hitting the bank's server, and bouncing off the firewall I had erected 24 hours ago. "Declined," Julian whispered, the words strangling in his throat. "It says, balance 0. "Let me see that!" Tara shrieked, snatching the tablet from him. I heard her nails clicking frantically against the glass screen. "Refresh the page! Refresh it! It must be a glitch. The Wi-Fi is spotty here." "It's not the Wi-Fi!" Julian yelled, his voice rising to a panic pitch. "Check the savings! Check the bonds!" "I'm checking!" Tara screamed back. "Oh my God! Julian, look!" "What?" "It's empty," she breathed, her voice hollow with horror. "The main trust, the savings, the investment portfolio, it all says $0. Even the household account, it's all gone." "That's impossible!" Julian roared, and I heard the sound of a chair being kicked over. "Arthur just left. He just filed the papers. The money should be mine. Did he steal it? Did that old lawyer steal it?" "Call him!" Tara yelled. "Call Arthur right now!" I decided that was my cue. I didn't walk down the stairs with the shuffling, hesitant gait of the confused old woman I had played for the last 2 weeks. I walked down with the measured, rhythmic descent of a queen entering her throne room. My hand glided along the banister, not for support, but for guidance. I held my head high, my spine straight, and I let the senile mask fall away completely, revealing the cold, hard features of Eleanor Vance, the forensic accountant who had buried men far smarter than my son. "There is no need to call Arthur," I said, my voice projecting clearly into the foyer, steady and calm. They both spun around, looking up at me. Their faces were masks of shock, pale, sweaty, and terrified. Julian held the tablet like a shield. Tara was clutching her pearls, her mouth gaping open. "Mom?" Julian stammered. "Mom, something's wrong. The bank. The accounts have been hacked. We need to call the police." I reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped on the Persian rug, standing 10 feet away from them. I looked at the overturned chair. I looked at the spilled champagne soaking into the wood floor. I looked at my son. "The accounts haven't been hacked, Julian," I said, smoothing the cuff of my cardigan. "They've been emptied." "By me. At 10:01 a.m. this morning." He stared at me, his brain trying to process the visual and auditory disconnect. The woman standing before him wasn't the fragile, trembling mother he had bullied into signing a document an hour ago. This woman was iron. "What?" he whispered. "But you didn't know. You were confused." "I was never confused," I said, taking a step forward. "I was observant. There is a difference." "But the papers!" Tara screeched, stepping forward, her face twisting into a snarl. "We have the papers! You signed them! We have power of attorney! We control everything!" "You signed the blue folder," I said simply. The color drained from Tara's face instantly. She knew. Somewhere in the back of her reptile brain, she remembered the 2 folders on the table. "The blue folder?" Julian asked, looking between me and Tara. "Arthur is very good at sleight of hand," I explained, walking over to the console table and picking up the bottle of Dom Perignon. I examined the label casually. "You see, the papers you signed did grant you control of the Vance estate. But yesterday, I transferred all liquid assets, every stock, every bond, every dollar of cash, out of the estate and into the Vance Integrity Fund, a charitable trust for victims of elder abuse." I looked at Julian, a small, cold smile playing on my lips. "You literally donated your inheritance to charity, Julian, with your own signature. It was a very generous gesture." "No!" Julian gasped, dropping the tablet. It hit the floor with a crack. "No, that's illegal. You can't do that. We have the power of attorney." "You do," I agreed, "and along with that power of attorney, you signed Clause 14. Do you recall reading Clause 14? Julian shook his head, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Clause 14 states that the signatory, that's you, accepts full personal liability for all debts and encumbrances attached to the estate. I recited from memory. "And since I placed a restrictive conservation covenant on this property yesterday, the house has a market value of $0. It cannot be sold. It cannot be developed. It is a dead asset." I took a step closer to him. He flinched. "So, to summarize," I said, counting off on my fingers. "You have no access to my money. You have a house you cannot sell. And by signing that document, you legally accepted responsibility for the maintenance of the property and any debts you incurred in anticipation of the transfer." I pointed to his phone, which was still connected to the open line with the loan shark. "I believe that gentleman on the phone is waiting for his $2.5 million, I said softly. "And now, thanks to your signature, that debt is legally tied to you, and you have absolutely no way to pay it." "You bitch!" Tara screamed, lunging at me. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I just held up my hand, holding the small black audio recorder I had pulled from my pocket. "Stop," I commanded, my voice cracking like a whip. Tara froze, her claws inches from my face. I have recorded every conversation in this house for the last 2 weeks, I said, holding the device up. I have you on tape conspiring to defraud me. I have you on tape bribing Dr. Thorne. I have photos of the nursing home application you filled out. I saw the fight go out of Tara. She collapsed inward, stumbling back against the wall. The nursing home, Julian whispered, looking at the floor. You found that? I found everything, Julian, I said, my voice dropping to a register of profound disappointment. I found the loan shark papers in your briefcase. I found the listing agreement. I heard you crying on the phone at 2 a.m. I walked over to him. He looked broken, a shell of a man. I wanted to hug him. I wanted to slap him. I did neither. I gave you a chance, I said, my voice trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. When I left the cash in the library, that was a test. If you had returned it, we wouldn't be standing here. If you had shown 1 ounce of honesty, 1 shred of love for your mother instead of her wallet, I would have helped you. I would have paid off your debt. I would have saved you. Julian looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. Mom, please. They'll kill me. Apex. They'll kill me. I know, I said coldly. That is why I included 1 final clause in the agreement. He looked at me with a flicker of hope. The Vance Integrity Fund has a provision, I said. It can issue a one-time emergency grant to family members in distress, enough to cover significant liabilities. You'll pay them? Julian sobbed, falling to his knees and grabbing my hand. Oh God, thank you. Thank you, Mom. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I pulled my hand away from his grasp. It felt slimy. I didn't say I would pay them, I corrected him. I said the trust can pay them, but the trust is controlled by Arthur Sterling, and Arthur has very specific instructions. What instructions? Tara asked, looking up from the floor, her makeup running down her face in black streaks. The grant is conditional, I said, looking down at my son. To receive the money to pay off your sharks, you must agree to the trust's terms. You will both leave this house immediately. You will sign a permanent restraining order, preventing you from coming within 500 feet of me. You will check into a rehabilitation facility for gambling addiction, paid for by the trust, and you will stay there for a minimum of 6 months. Rehab? Julian stammered. But, and, I continued, turning to look at Tara, you will file for divorce. Tara gasped. You can't make him do that. I can, I said calmly, and I am. Because the money is contingent on Julian cutting ties with all negative influences, and you, my dear, are the most negative influence of all. I looked back at Julian. He was kneeling on the champagne-soaked rug, looking between his mother and his wife. It's your choice, Julian, I said. You can keep your wife and your pride and deal with Apex Capital on your own. Or you can take the money, save your life, and lose everything else. The phone on the table squawked. Vance, you still there? I'm losing patience, Vance. Julian looked at the phone. He looked at Tara. Then, he looked at me. Where do I sign? He whispered. Tara let out a shriek of rage and threw her glass at him. It shattered against the wall, showering him with crystal shards. You coward! She screamed. You pathetic little worm! Get out, Julian said to her, his voice dull and dead. Get out, Tara. It's over. I watched them. I watched the marriage I had never approved of dissolve in seconds under the weight of greed and fear. I watched my son choose survival over loyalty. It was a victory. But as I stood there in the wreckage of my family, with the smell of stale champagne and betrayal in the air, it didn't feel like winning. It felt like surgery, necessary, bloody, and leaving a scar that would never heal. "I'm going to the library," I said, turning my back on them. "Arthur will be here in 20 minutes with the paperwork for the grant. Be ready to leave by the time he arrives." I walked away, listening to Tara sobbing and Julian weeping. I walked into my library and closed the heavy oak doors, shutting out the sound. I walked over to the window and looked out at the ocean. The storm was over. The sun was shining. The waves were calm. I was safe. My home was safe. My legacy was secure. I was entirely alone. Arthur Sterling arrived exactly 20 minutes later, his sedan crunching up the gravel driveway with the punctuality of a hearse. I watched from the library window as he stepped out, briefcase in hand, his face set in a grim line that told me he knew exactly what had transpired in the last hour. He didn't knock. He simply opened the front door and walked into the foyer, where the wreckage of my family was still scattered across the floor like debris after a hurricane. I stayed in the library, listening to the low murmur of Arthur's voice as he laid out the terms of the surrender. I heard the rustle of papers, the restraining order, the admission forms for the rehabilitation center, the divorce petition, and the scratching of pens that signed away a marriage and a lifestyle in exchange for survival. There was no shouting now, no fighting, only the muffled sounds of Tara sobbing quietly, and Julian asking short, broken questions about where he was going to sleep that night. "The car is waiting, Julian," I heard Arthur say, his voice carrying through the heavy oak door. "The facility has a bed ready. You leave now, or the deal is void, and the creditors get your location." I heard the sound of footsteps dragging on the hardwood, heavy and reluctant. I moved away from the window and walked to the door of the library, resting my hand on the brass knob. A part of me, the mother who had bandaged his scraped knees and cheered at his little league games, wanted to run out there and hold him, to tell him it would be all right, to fix it one last time. But the silver fox, the woman who had just saved her own life, kept the door shut. I knew that if I opened it, if I gave him even an inch of softness, he would take a mile of my soul. He needed to break completely before he could ever be fixed, and I could not be the one to hold the pieces. The front door opened with a heavy groan of hinges that hadn't been oiled in years. "Goodbye," Julian whispered, the word hanging in the air like smoke. There was no answer from the house. The door clicked shut. The sound was final. It was the sound of a book closing, the sound of a gavel striking, the sound of a heart sealing itself off to survive. I listened to Arthur's car start up, followed by the engine of the car Julian and Tara had arrived in. Driven by Tara, I assumed, for the last time before they parted ways. The engines faded into the distance, growing fainter and fainter, until they were swallowed by the sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs. Silence rushed back into the house, filling the void they left behind. It was not the fearful silence of the last 2 weeks, the silence of holding one's breath. It was a clean silence. It was the silence of an empty church after a funeral, hollow but holy. I opened the library door and stepped out into the hallway. The air still smelled of their cheap desperation, stale champagne, sweat, and heavy perfume. I wrinkled my nose and walked to the front door, throwing it wide open to let the salt breeze scour the foyer. I walked to the kitchen, my footsteps echoing on the tiles. The table was still cluttered with the remains of their breakfast: half-eaten pancakes, cold coffee, the water glass Julian had slammed down. I picked up the glass and walked to the sink, pouring the water down the drain and watching it swirl away. I began to clean. I didn't call the housekeeper. I needed to do this myself. It was an exorcism. I washed the dishes, scrubbing the plates until they squeaked. I wiped down the counters, erasing the rings of wine and coffee. I swept the floor, gathering the dust and the crumbs and the shards of the broken crystal glass into a pile and dumping them unceremoniously into the trash. I moved through the house, room by room. I stripped the bed in the guest room, pulling the sheets off in a violent bundle and stuffing them into a garbage bag because I couldn't bear the thought of washing them. I opened every window in the east wing, letting the wind whip through the curtains and chase away the stagnant air of their conspiracy. When I reached the front hallway again, I saw something glinting on the floor near the coat rack. I bent down, my knees popping slightly, and picked it up. It was my keychain, the one with the silver fox charm. Tara must have dropped it in her haste to leave, or perhaps she had thrown it down in spite. I held the cold metal in my palm, running my thumb over the tiny silver ears of the fox. It was scratched and tarnished, but it was still whole. I slipped it into my pocket, where it belonged. The grandfather clock chimed 4 times. It was tea time. I went back to the kitchen and filled the copper kettle. I performed the ritual with slow, deliberate movements, finding comfort in the muscle memory. I measured the loose-leaf Earl Grey into the strainer. I waited for the water to boil. I poured it over the leaves and watched the water turn dark and rich. I carried my cup and saucer into the living room and sat in my wingback chair, facing the ocean. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, painting the water in shades of violet and gold. The light hit the dust motes dancing in the air, just as it had in the first chapter. But now the dust was settling. I took a sip of tea. It was hot, floral, and perfect. It didn't taste like gas. It didn't taste like fear. I looked around the room. It was just me. There were no voices in the walls. There were no footsteps on the ceiling. There was no one plotting my demise in the guest room. I was alone. Some might call it a tragedy to be 72 and alone in a mansion by the sea, having just banished one's only child. They might say I was cold. They might say I was cruel. But as I sat there, feeling the warmth of the tea spread through my chest, I didn't feel tragic. I felt safe. I felt the immense, heavy, luxurious weight of peace settling over my shoulders like a mink coat. I had been hunted. I had been trapped. I had been underestimated, and I had won. I took another sip of tea and smiled at the empty room. "Checkmate," I whispered. Narrator voice shift, direct address to audience. So, that is my story. It wasn't the retirement I had planned, and it certainly wasn't the family reunion I had hoped for. But life, like a good audit, rarely gives you the numbers you want. It only gives you the numbers you have. I have to ask you, what would you have done? If you were in my shoes, sitting in that chair, watching your own flesh and blood sharpen the knife to carve up your life, would you have signed the papers? Would you have gone quietly into the dark night of that nursing home? Or would you have done what I did? Would you have burned the bridge to save the castle? Some people tell me I was too harsh. They say a mother's love should be unconditional. But I believe that respect should be reciprocal. And I believe that sometimes the only way to save someone is to let them fall. I would love to hear what you think. Was I a monster, or was I a warrior? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe in justice, cold, hard, and served with a cup of tea, then please subscribe to Silver Fox Legacy. I have many more stories to tell, and trust me, I'm just getting started. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your checkbook closed.